Thomas Jockin. Oh, how are you doing, Mr. Jockin? You doing all right?
Doing fantastic. My,
Oh,
I literally about just a few minutes ago, my course at Halcyon Guild has been published. So a long time coming, 2 years in the works.
oh my gosh. Where can they go? HalcyonGuild.com. I'm so thrilled. We'll market like crazy. So where do they need to go, Jockin? Everyone needs to take it immediately.
Yeah. I think it's Halcyon Academy. You can find a link through there. I think halcyonguild.org.
Oh my gosh. Well, that is thrilling. We'll have an OG about it and different thing. Mr. Rivera, it is good to see you. I just finished your talk with Mr. Luber. It was outstanding. So Halcyon Guild Academy, anyone watching this, if there is one person on this planet that you need to take a class with about the topic of beauty, it is Mr. Thomas Jockin. So everyone needs to sign up with that immediately. Congratulations. That is outstanding. And I'm so glad and well done. And that is really cool. Congratulations. How did the presentation go the other night, by the way? Thank you for stopping in at your hotel last week.
Yeah, of course. No, the talk went great. It was a great conversation. I'm really glad I did it. And yeah, I mean, it's crazy. This investigation of beauty in Plato has been 2 years in the works. It's kind of nuts. I was talking to Johannes about that. So it's crazy to think here we are after 2 years of work.
Oh.
And the course is finally up. I'm really happy about that.
Well, congratulations, sir. That is absolutely outstanding. Well, this is perfect because the other thing, so we were talking about beauty last week, aesthetic, the notion that the difference between a beauty and an aesthetic is that an experience of the beautiful has a command on you, which using Mr. Luber's language would be a theme. So when something is aesthetic, you may say, oh, that's beautiful. The table is set. And what we were talking about is how a meta aesthetic, as I was calling an aesthetic of everything, like a theory of everything, which can be oppressive, meaning everything is supposed to look this way, like the table's supposed to be set. Roger Scruton uses that example, and it is therefore, quote unquote, beautiful because everything is set. Well, that seems to be a different kind of aesthetic from the beauty of the Plato that strikes you and says, you must change your life. And kind of was speaking a bit with Mr. Luber on a difference between a meta aesthetic as a sort of notion of how things are supposed to look, which is entailed in the beautiful, but not just what the beautiful is, where the beautiful also brings a command, a certain sort of, you must change your life. And if you're able to experience something and it doesn't bring with it a command, then it is merely aesthetic, not beautiful. That doesn't mean it's bad, but it does mean that there's something different. And what's very interesting with that is the difference between the aesthetic or the meta aesthetic or what you choose your own adventure term is that it is found in the encounter. You have to encounter beauty. We've talked about the strike of beauty, which I also think is very interesting because, you were talking, Javier, with Luber about Levinas, and the notion of the way that you overcome the big other, like Zupancha says, is that, Luber was saying it is in the encounter of the other. If you have an obligation to the other, but the other is only in the encounter, that can avoid the totalitarianism that could come from a certain sort of guilt-based obligation of you must take care of the other person. The other is, as Ivan Illich said, the man on the side of the road, right? And we know Mr. Ebert also stresses the notion of the encounter, the surprise. We talk a lot about the surprise. He talks about limit, and we talked about how the only way to actually find your limit is to encounter it. And you cannot think a limit, because if you think a limit, it's not actually a limit. It has to be a surprise. So the other, as the ground of ethical obligation, must be a surprise, and it must be an encounter. And we talked that one time about encounterology, which is interesting as well. So that all said, following Levinas, the only way to have morality not become a big other is in the encounter. The only way to have beauty not be reducible to the aesthetic is in an encounter. And then the question becomes, what does the socioeconomic or political or common structure look like to encourage the encounter, which of course encounters are scary and difficult, and how do you train yourself to be able to handle the encounter? And then I've been reading James K. Smith, and then I have a lot to say. I've been trying to draw more connections between analogy, because I've been reading, you probably know of it, Mr. Jockin, but my favorite book by Hofstadter is this book called Surfaces and Essences. Yeah, so this is, and I'm trying to connect this with why is it that aesthetics formulate us so much, following like we were talking about Pierre, in sociology, like when you see something, it formulates you. There's another guy, then I'll pass it to Javier and Jockin, called James K. Smith, who talks about cultural liturgies. When you go to the mall, you then love the things you see at the mall, and that works on your habits because you are what you love. So aesthetic works on love. But here's the question. why are we so susceptible to aesthetics working on our love and shaping us? Why? Like, what is it? Well, I think it may have something to do with the fact that the brain is analogous, which of course all the classical philosophers have been saying forever. But we're smarter than them. We rediscover things better. So there's this notion of the analogous, meaning that we, as James K. Smith says it, we become what we are formed by, not what we're informed by. We spend way too much time thinking about information versus formulation, when really the subject develops in terms of a formulation, not just the downloading of information. Well, what's interesting about that is an emphasis on the encounter, in my opinion, is far more formulative than informative, because you're encountering a surprise that has a formulative effect on you, right? And so I wonder if one of the issues, and I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Jockin, is that I wonder if one of the issues, if we've tried to approach way too many philosophical topics in terms of information versus situations of formulation, which gets into encounter and aesthetic. And that's one of the reasons why we've fallen into so many ethical wastes of time, aesthetic waste of time, political waste of time, because we've been basing it way too much in an informative register versus a formulative register. There's more to say, but let me give it to Javier. Mr. Rivera, it's good to see you. And I've enjoyed, I must say, I thought your talk with Julie Rest was my favorite of hers. I really did. I thought that was the best one I'd seen of hers. I really enjoyed it. So you did a really good job in that talk.
Yeah, I'm happy I brought that out of her, actually.
Yeah, I thought it was really good.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this question of the aesthetics. I've been reading Nietzsche. I've been actually reading The Birth of Tragedy. I've just been reading a lot of Nietzsche lately. But I do think there's something interesting between the Apollonian, Dionysian, and then what Nietzsche introduces as the aesthetic Socratism. Now, I don't think this is an accurate description of Socrates at all, but I think what we're getting at when you say we view the world aesthetically, I think it's precisely how Nietzsche described it, as an aesthetic Socratism is, he quotes, "To be beautiful, everything must be intelligible." So I think right there, that's when the beauty collapses into the good. Is that so? I don't think the name, I think the name is obviously a little bit funny and ironic that he's saying aesthetic Socratism, but I think it's a good label for what is happening when the beauty is collapsed into the good. It's trying to make it intelligible. And I think that's the part where people don't even think aesthetically anymore. Because, I agree that we're viewing it aesthetically, but I don't even think people understand that they are viewing it aesthetically. Which is why I rather say that they're viewing it morally. And I've also been thinking about this, because the Dionysian elements that Nietzsche talks about is fundamentally about suspense and surprise in a tragedy, right? You can't calculate what's going to happen in the story. So it's a Dionysian element. And I think we need that Dionysian element when it comes to an encounterology of the beauty, right? The other thing is I've been also thinking about, because I've been reading Nietzsche again, is I've been playing with this concept of the noble common, right? The noble common. Yeah. What would a noble common be for Nietzsche? Because he's very critical about equality. And I was thinking, equality is a kind of tautology when we talk about it, right? Like, my value is equality. Why do you value equality? Because I want everybody to be equal. It's a tautology, but I don't understand the value behind equality other than the tautology that is being said. So, what is actually being wanted with equality? Because then there's a tricky move here where equality collapses difference into sameness. And then that makes a really risky, dangerous move, because actually there's an abuse that happens within the collapse of difference into sameness, which people don't realize. You could take autism or neurological spectrum kind of differences. if you resort that to a common or a sameness, you do a kind of disservice to the individual, because now it's like the common man says that you should be able to do this. This is what everybody is capable of. So what is really being valued with equality? And I think the actual move that is being valued in equality is that somebody wants to create a new value. But it's not a given, though. And I think equality takes itself as a given, as an unquestionable value. And it's, for me, it's a mystery as to actually what is being said in this word equality as such. The other thing, so I've been thinking about what does it mean to have a noble common, which is sort of my Nietzschean interpretation. A noble common, so far as I've gathered, is somebody that is a people that create values, and they don't collapse what is bad into evil. So they maintain the dichotomy of good and bad, but they don't collapse what is bad into evil, which is Nietzsche's critique of the slave morality. Like the slave morality collapses what is bad into evil, and they live that dichotomy of good and evil. So I do think there is this kind of tendency within the notion of equality that everything that is unequal is evil, right? So yeah, I've been really wanting to think what is, because I do think it's a kind of funny doing of a paradox of noble common. What does it mean to be a noble common? Meaning that the common isn't actually possible, but what is noble is the fact that we create the values, and that would be the commonality within the noble, that we are creating the values, and then we reside within this dichotomy of good and bad. But good and bad is just, you could say, what is responding to the situation at that time. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. And I think that is a wonderful topic. And Thomas Wen and Andrew Luber, it is really good to see you. I was just mentioning, Mr. Luber, how much I enjoyed your talk with Mr. Bavera on storytelling and this point. So we were saying on this idea that you were bringing up, that the way that ethics and liveness avoids a big other is by basing it in the encounter, this radical encounter. And we talked about encounterology. Mr. Ebert has talked about encountering limits is the only way to think limits. You can't think limits, you have to encounter it. And we were also saying, if the difference between beauty and aesthetic per se is the theme, the command that comes forth, the strike of beauty, as we've talked about, then the difference between beauty and aesthetics, in a sense, cannot be thought, only encountered, which of course makes sense if that when beauty and the good collapse, as Mr. Jockin has said, the way I would language it, not that there's ever a perfect language, that's part of the fun, is that when beauty and good collapse, then it's an aesthetic. But here's the problem. Beauty, the moment it says you must change your life, it gives you a theme. That theme is intelligible, of which you then naturally cannot help but interpret the beauty or the being, if we use the being with Mr. Wynn's work accordingly, you cannot help but then project that intelligibility onto the beauty that gave you the theme, and that then runs the risk of collapsing it into the aesthetic. So the moment we talk about beauty, we're talking about a great instability. Likewise, the moment we talk about morality as based on the encounterology, we're dealing with a great instability, because if I'm to treat this person as a kind of basis of ethics, why not treat all people as a basis of ethics? Why would you not want to do that? Wouldn't it be like more moral if you could do that? What is your basis of not trying to apply it to some sort of systems level, right? So there's a great instability. And I think one of the reasons why we then tend to move away, and this I think actually then gets into, because at this point in the game, I think we're dealing with these very similar things that are different by a little bit, which makes all the difference in the world. So you mentioned the tautology, which I will associate with the equal sign. What's the difference between the equal sign and equivalence? As Mr. Ebert has talked about it, what's the difference between sameness and similarity? Everything. What's the difference between a tautology and an analogy? An analogy, I can never say this frickin' word, analogy. If I say like anna, know that I'm trying to say analogy. What's the difference between a tautology and an analogy? A lot. And so here's the issue. If Mr. Hofstadter is correct, if Ms. Hofstadter is correct, then all thinking is not tautological, it is analogical, which means the term that Hofstadter uses is that all words are more like halos than they are definitions. Like it is a range. The category of tree is like a halo, not that things that you say a similarity of phenomenon that falls under that category analogically are included in that halo, per se, like a halo, like a ring, and it's an ever-expanding ring. And this is how he describes the category, right? We've only had empiricisms of facts, not empiricisms of halos. And this has led to trouble. Like, we have not thought about encountering the concrete world as the generation and expansion of a halo, of which is what is another term that you use, the boundary condition, which is the theme. But that very boundary condition is trying to get at the thing that cannot be bound, that is the phenomenon of tree, only analogically approached. So here's the issue. When we talk about equality and ethics, we're still in the realm of tautology, not analogy. We're looking for algebra, not halos, because here's the issue. Once you start talking about intelligibility of the halo, the analogy versus the tautology, you're talking about an open intelligibility. And this is the only way to keep the beauty from collapsing to the good, to have a kind of open intelligibility, where you see that the only intelligibility is a halo intelligibility, an analogous intelligibility. That's scary, because it's fluffy and flexible and moving and active, and good frickin' gosh, right? So the moment you move to the encounterology, you're talking about the active subject. And that's quite difficult. And the brain wants to save energy. We just want to know what's good, what's bad, not talk about some sort of expanding halo or range of the good. We want to know how to treat people before we encounter them so that we can't screw up. So there's a lot of fear in all of this. And then the brain wants to save energy. So it just wants to have everything be an equal sign, not an analogous sign, because then I know what to do. Like, the reason AI is spreading is because we actually subconsciously want AI to spread, because we're already artificial intelligences. If we're not analogous, if we're tautological, if we're looking for equality versus equivalence, then we're already artificial intelligences, because we're not halo intelligences. So what's happening with AI is simply an extension of the history that we've already chosen. But let me pass to Mr. Jockin and Mr. Luber. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir.
Yes, sir. Good times. Actually, Javier, your point, this is interesting, your point of good and evil with this, idea of the noble common. Do you notice that both of those as contraries would be good? It's kind of interesting. We don't actually look at that. There's not even that language of good. It's just like this. I mean, it's kind of my point in my course, is that the project of the beautiful, the challenge about it and why we have to really take it seriously is because it goes all downstream. You don't get to just ignore beauty as just as indifferent, like it doesn't really matter to philosophical projects, because we have the good and we have the true. But the problem is that these problems go right down to them too. And this is a great example of it. That language of the capture of the good and/or even evilness and badness, it's the same kind of point. This is interesting. I just want to draw that out. And by the way, actually, I was talking to a colleague recently about this issue of the equal, because it's a lot of times what they want with that is some argument. What they really want to say is unity, but it's not, because what we just brought up, equal means the same, yet oneness can have difference. For example, I am a one, right? I am one man, but a man is made of parts that are different: arms, legs, heads, physical, social, spiritual, right? There's within a unity of a one, there is a grouping, a substance. There's a grouping of difference, the power to hold differences and contraries and all that. The equal obliterates that, because it says, no, under this domain, it must be raw equalness, sameness. There is no, it's a virtual object. That's basically what we're getting at. It's an abstraction, virtual abstraction. That's why when people call it as a property, it's indefinite by nature, but in a way very different from beauty, as we're discussing, right? It's very different. I think one of the ways the differences hold, it's not an indefinite excess. It's actually quite the opposite. It's actually a collapse. It's a complete flattening of difference. And then it relates to the point, that's because it's all it's unfortunately the miscarriage of justice. It's a complete misunderstanding of what justice is. Aristotle talked about it, because actually it's ironic today that in wokeism, the equitable has been used as a term and taken to be their justification about that the neoliberal arguments of justice are not satisfactory. We need to be equitable. But that comes from Aristotle. And it's so interesting, because Aristotle's argument is that, a couple notes, just spitballing. One is that the universal rule cannot apply to all particular circumstances. The equitable one is the adjustment of the law to the particular circumstance. It's what is that? That's difference. It's addressing of difference. And there's a line about the leaden ruler. It basically means it's a flexible ruler that can measure a statue, because the statue is an organic shape. So if you just had a flat edge to it, there's a gap difference between, say you have a line to my shoulder. There's going to be a gap distance between the shoulder and my head, for example. A straight ruler would miss the mark. It would be inaccurate. Versus a flexible ruler could follow the contour and have an accurate understanding. There's a line about that when we deal with indefinite objects, we need indefinite measures. So that's what that's playing on. So when we talk about the equal as the just, that's an example of a straight ruler, right? It kind of locks in a virtual abstraction. Versus this discussion, talked about the negative pragmatism symposium, the discussion about what would be the measure of the beautiful and what we're talking about. It would have to be this kind of measure, measure by indefiniteness in some way, which would be kind of riffing on the point, a kind of response of the observing of difference. Ooh, I like that, by belonging. That's a fun angle. Because it's basically applying to a one, right? A kind of unity. That's true. I think Daniel's points about the intelligible and beauty. Actually, that was Javier. Excuse me. That was I think absolutely accurate, because that's probably the problem with Daniel's riff on that. Totally the case. The problem with it. And the inform versus formation part, I think, is quite good too. But it was all very good. Those are my replies. My yields.
Outstanding. And Mr. Wynn has wonderful quote. I love that point on A is A from the principle of identity with Heidegger. That's wonderful, Mr. Wynn. And the measured by belonging is exactly right. Heck yeah. Really like that. So a few things come to mind. It would also see on this notion of an immeasurable can only be measured by an immeasurable. The funny thing is that a particular encounter with a particular person in a way is immeasurable. It can only be experienced. Like when you get to the raw particularity, it can't, in a sense, it can be measured in the sense that it can be made intelligible, but the experience itself is distinct from the measurement of the experience. That's what's so weird, right? Like, so when we talk about anything that is indefinite, can only be participated in or encountered or experienced, and the less thinking involved in a funny way, the more it is indefinite. Which, how do you not think about something and encounter it? Well, that's a surprise. So it almost has to, by definition, be a surprise. When the indefinite is measured by an indefinite, it is in the surprise, and the measure of it is the unfolding of the experience of it, which is weird. And then belonging, if we're talking about between the being lowercase and uppercase being, belonging has something to do with your readiness or sustainability in that, your feeling of care in that, your feeling of becoming in that, because the triplex we talked about of belonging with care, sustainability, and becoming. In that, you're like, oh yeah, I'm ready for this. Yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be. Can you be in the surprise and say, this is where I'm supposed to be? That seems to be the challenge of belonging today. At Voicecraft last night, they were talking about psychic flexibility, the ability to psychologically be flexible to handle diversity, global pluralism, and different things like that. And I would argue that constant training in terms of a relation with the beautiful, which is the indefinite, is exactly what habituates you to having the kind of subjectivity that would have the possibility of, in the encounter, the surprise, having the possibility of saying, I'm glad I'm here, which is more likely to follow through and be formulated according to if when you encountered being and it gave you the theme, you must change your life, you actually did it. And so then you would be conditioned to actually be able to handle that, of which the average person on earth must be capable to keep global pluralism from collapsing. So then the question is, what would it look like to create a political economy, economic order, and system that would habituate people through their loves, as James K. Smith talks about, to create the kind of habitus, so that it would be able to find in that surprise, I belong here. Now, I also think the relation between aesthetics as the general category. I'm not against the word aesthetics, even if I'm making a distinction between aesthetics and beauty. We can't be against all words, even if all words might need to have double quotations around them, which I struggle with in writing. But anyway, it's really hard because they're all halos, dang it. They're all freaking halos, as Hofstadter says. It is funny to think that when I find something beautiful, and then I'll pass it to Luber and Javier, when I find something beautiful, you don't have to convince me to care about it. You don't have to create a law that says you must take care of this thing. I am immediately convinced. I immediately want to care about it. It is funny that ethics as law seems quite different as the ethical-like behavior that just simply seems to follow from the experience of beauty. Because if beauty gives you a theme, a command, you're like, well, of course I'll follow that. It's beautiful, dang it. But if I say you must do this, they're like, well, F you, I don't want to do that, which actually could provide evidence of why beauty is in a way higher than the good and true. Because with the beautiful, I'm convinced to do the good, and I'm also convinced that's true. Where if I encounter something that's true, I might just go, so what? If I encounter something that's good, I might say F you, because I'm not going to follow the government. But with the beautiful, in the encounter, not the idea of, in the surprise, there's a certain automatic assent that occurs. That, funny enough, in a way is neurotic, to use that Lacanian terms, in a way is an authority, but it's the authority of a kind of love. It's the authority of a God that cares about you. You're like, well, of course, this is good for me. And thus is an alter identified together, which in Hegel's philosophy of right is the only way to find freedom. So here's the point. In beauty, isness and oughtness come together. But this is where but this is what's weird. The collapse of the beautiful in the good is also the is and ought, but there's one version of it that seems to turn it to the aesthetic that is problematic, but there's another version of it that is following the theme that came from the unbound isness. How do you tell the difference? How do you tell the difference? By being in the encounter. By actually being in the encounter, to know that there's some sort of collapse of the beautiful and the good that's problematic, but then there's also an unstable relationship between the beautiful and the good based on the encounter that you maintain with the subjectivity that always is open to the beautiful. So you're always having to deal with the variables that run the risk of collapsing into one another so that you can hold them together unstably to continue to experience the beautiful. That requires a kind of subjectivity that is conditioned to hold that kind of instability together. And that's really, really hard. But the more and more that we know that thinking is analogous versus tautological, that it is approximate versus like direct, and the more we know that the ethical, the aesthetic, and et cetera, so forth, must be based in the particular encounter, that it is the immeasurable by the immeasurable, the more we will not be surprised when it turns out reality is like that, because we are prepared for it. And thus we would be more likely to train ourselves for that instability. But there was a lot there. Let me give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Rivera. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
It is good to see you too. Thank you for spending the time to read the script. And yeah, that meant a lot. You haven't met him, but Tyler, I showed him your response and he was like, oh my God, who is this guy? He's like fucking unreal that he put the time and really put thoughts in. I'm like, dude, you have no fucking idea. And then congrats, Jockin, on the course. I like the cover that you put out. Very, very nice. Yeah, I got to see if I have the time to take the course. I want to dive in. I want to be schooled by you bad. But anyway, a couple things. I would say whenever we take a measurement, like I like how the measurement can't be reduced to the totality of an experience. So the way I interpret that is a measurement is just a recognition of a story. And the story can't be reduced to the story. Because there's a constant rewriting process. There's a constant remeasuring, and it changes what that story is. So in a certain sense, the measuring is the story itself, but it's only that possible story, and it doesn't. And you can find different measurements that way. Another thing with like what you're saying, it's just making me think about, and I have to rewatch what Javier was saying about what Bard's comments were, but it's like it's like, is he an atheist? Because basically if you're not recognizing the position of beauty, or forgetting, which I want to get into because I think that's a real problem, basically forgetting the order of things. And that's part of the order itself, is forgetting the order. Because that's a real problem. Because that's basically what we're circling here, is essentially there is this order of beauty, but beauty, once it reveals itself, it conceals itself pretty quickly. So it's built-in feature that you forget it. So how do you honor that built-in feature while at the same time prioritizing that feature? That seems very paradoxical. You can't forget and remember at the same time. So there seems to be an art to that. But yeah, like part of remembering, and this is why I'm in a certain sense pro goodness, not over beauty or anything like that, because it's clear that the ordering is beauty's first, like that, absolutely. But in the act of remembering that beauty's first, what happens is you have to grade what is in front of you. So, like, for example, to say like the water is hot, that means the water met a certain threshold for it to be then deemed as hot. That to me is in the realm of goodness, because you're any type of grading that's going on is based off of like it achieving its threshold to a significant degree for you to be able to label such whatever. And that to me is, from like a linguistic standpoint, what good is. That's what it's for me. It seems pretty hard to get around that, because like what else do you call that? Or if you don't address that reality, how do you remember basically the ordering of beauty? Because you need to be able to point out, name something that is hitting that threshold, which once it hits that threshold, in a certain sense, beauty kind of is reminded in that moment where it meets the threshold. So there's something to that. Also, the equality is a really interesting question, because and I've spoken about this with Javier and Jockin. Like, for example, like when I was writing the book with Daniel and Alex, when we got to the irony chapter, when we got like, there's a certain point where it's like, okay, Daniel is like the lead. Daniel has like he has taken over, and I was more than okay with that, even though I put in, years of thinking and work into that. And that's because we all shared the same beatific vision, which made us equal. But at the same time, there's a certain recognition that another person in that shared project has a better vision of the project. So when that happens, my ego, in a certain sense, recognized that and took like a step back, allowed that to happen. And I think that's very hard to do because people aren't looking at it in terms of that beatific vision. So I think a lot of this equality business has to do with reframing the ego, like we're talking about, making it more flexible. But how do you make it more flexible? Like, forgive me, Javier, in a pragmatic way. Like, because that to me is so hard to do. And it's not common. And I think the only way to, like, you can't really control that per se. Like, another example that comes to my mind is, let's say like Shannon, my writing partner, he's getting married in like a couple weeks. And let's say he's talking to me about marital advice, which would be a huge mistake. But let's say he was. And I say something that changes the boundary conditions of how he is seeing his relationship. Then he immediately allows me in that moment to take control of his vision of what he's seeing in his life, because he recognized that I am also seeing the vision, but in a more transparent way that will allow him to then reestablish new boundary conditions. So the question to me is, how do we get people to be in an open position where they're leaning into the possibility of changing their boundary conditions? Because I think the ego in today's, like colloquially speaking, I think the ego wants to stronghold the boundary conditions. Kind of like Jockin, like the artist who wants to just strangle the film. Like that's what people want to do with their own life. And it's very hard to dislodge them from that mentality in order to be open, because basically, I always say, like as a joke when I'm writing with people, it's like, oh yeah, I'm wrong. I was wrong about that, which now instantly made me right. Like that's a sort of the mentality. So like, how do we get people to embrace being wrong so that they can be right? That they can see being wrong is actually a good thing, because being wrong is a recognition of now them being right. And like, I think that's just like very difficult to do without faith. It's just, I don't see a way around that. And like, I'm not even talking about like a strict theological faith, just a faith of being open to your vision not being what that is. Just it's that you're willing to change the vision. And I think that's part of what a vision is, like embracing that. And that has to do with like confidence and like with Ebert's courage, because that means you have to accept that things leading up to that weren't necessarily fruitful. So I guess it really comes down to, how do we get people to be more courageous in how they identify with themselves? And that doesn't mean to be like, oh, I'm not Andrew anymore. I'm actually a giant kitty cat. Like that's not what I mean. And I think a lot of people, I think like today's trend is kind of going toward, let's be courageous with our identity, in almost like an inverted sixth sense in my mind, where they're strong holding their identity in a much stronger sense, in a way that isn't open. It's like, oh, I really can choose what I want to be. And that, I think, is missing the point. I think the courageous part is, I don't know what I am, and therefore I want to open myself, be vulnerable to the other, to show me who I am, and that it's a shared project. So how do you make a shared project? It seems to be the goal. And then one more thing. I think anybody that has genuinely fallen in love will understand the beatific vision and the courage to have a shared project, because they're willing to change for that loved one. They're willing to adapt and dislike like certain things, because they are truly in love with the other person. So unfortunately, if that is the case, I do see this as something that is out of our control, and that we can just like describe it, tell people that this is a feature of reality. But if like how I think about love is an access point to seeing this like beatific vision, and like forgetting, oh wait, I actually don't like this food, but this loved one wants me to try it. I'm just being crude, so therefore I'm gonna try it, like make them happy, kind of thing. I think there's something to that. I'm forgetting my thoughts at the moment, but I've been talking too much. I'll pass it off.
You never talk too much. That was outstanding. There is absolutely, and I knew you were a kitty cat. Everyone knew it. There is always there's something about love that has an excess, ergo a lack as excess, that is toward the indefinite. And so once you fall in love with something, there's some sort of excess to you that you are lacking that also points to an immeasurable, right? Something that cannot be measured except participated in. So it's not by chance that God is love, love being some sort of supreme principle of reality is all going together, because there's something about love that is a giving yourself over to an excess that is a lack, because a lack is an excess from your faculties that simultaneously says back to you, as beauty, you must change your life. And so it is absolutely something about love that is about all this. I think what has happened, so there's a few things. The question of the focusing on the good and the ethical. One of the reasons we get in trouble with thinking the relation of the ethical with the beautiful is because the notion of the ethical has been captured by the nation state. Where when you go back to religion, ethics was a lot more about ritual, being prepared for sacrifice, doing prayer and certain procedures as a waiting. You know, Mr. Rivera has spoken about waiting in Buber and different things. Well, in a lot of religions, ethics is way more tied to a certain sort of preparing oneself to meet the condition to be able to participate in a shared project, ergo a ritual. When there's no guarantee God shows up, he might show up. Maybe it's 400 years later. Maybe you go into the Holy and Holies and die. There's a notion of, oh, wait, you're sinning? You're not going to be able to pray. Because as you're praying or doing your prayers 5 times a day, you're actually thinking of all the terrible things. Like the ethical is, if you are not doing the ethical, you cannot wait. This is the problem. Like once you get that ethics is about having the capacity to wait, to dwell, to not have expectations, the ethical is how you do negative pragmatism per se. Unless you are doing ethics, you do not meet the conditions to be able to stay in the useless and to carry out the useless, the ritual, without any idea of what's going to occur. What has happened is now ethics is following the law, which is separate from any waiting. It's about citizenship. What do you need to do to be a citizen in the United States of America? Whereas in more religious traditions, the ethical is tied to what do you need to do to be able to participate in ritual, of which is a space of waiting, of where the beautiful might show up, God might show up and then go away. Maybe not, but the ethical is the perpetual daily habitus to be able to participate in the waiting ritual per se. The Sabbath, the Sunday, let's turn off. Why do we turn off? Why are we not allowed to work on Sunday? Well, just wait, you'll see. Just keep doing it. Like there's a kind of ethics you have to actually stick to the Jewish Sabbath. There's a lot of freaking ethical work you have to do to actually do it, right? And then nothing comes of it. And yet you do it again. And yet you do it again. You see in the religious conception of the ethical, the relation of the beautiful and the ethical far clearer, because you had a system of ritual and sacrifice and procedure. Like you don't have any, like it's very easy to think of nation states as having ethics without ritual. I can't think of any religions that have ethical codes that don't also have rituals. The connection between the ethical and the ritual cannot be overstated. And the ethical is for the sake of being able to be in the ritual, which is like always something about awaiting, which of course makes sense because it is about being able to meet the sufficient degree to actually experience the beautiful. So the religion's focused on the good, just like you're saying, but for the sake of being able to enter the space of the beautiful breaking forth, which is more difficult for us to think today because the word ethical is tied to legal law nation state. And so once you have that, which is not so much tied to a breaking through of the indefinite, the nation state doesn't want you to believe in the indefinite. It wants you to think it's the ultimate authority, dang it. Like the nation state isn't going to have an ethics that's linked to some sort of waiting. It's going to be like the big other, dang it. Of course it is. And so like, you know, you're always speaking about Levinas. It's not by chance that Levinas is theological. Like what Levinas is talking about is very hard to make sense of in the context of the nation state. But if we think about it in that I, thou encounter, you can't legislate I, thou is religious ritual. And so there's this notion of like purification, right? Like many religions, to a fault even, had, and then I'll give it to Rivera and Mr. Wynn, to a fault had an emphasis on purity. But why did you need purity? So that when you did the ritual in the waiting, you did it well. You were actually able to wait without thinking about something else. You were actually able to wash that dish like the Buddhists talk about and frickin' wash it. You needed the purity so that your mind wasn't going everywhere and you were actually able to be useless, per se. Negative pragmatism. It's really, really frickin' hard to be useless. But the ethical and the purification and all of these things were for the sake of the ability to carry out that practice without guarantee, so the indefinite of the beauty could be honored. And there was a space you were carving out in your life that even if the beauty didn't break forth, you were honoring the possibility of its breaking forth in doing that very useless as a constant reminder of its existence. Because you brought up memory. Memory is massive in religions. Don't forget the God who got you out of Egypt. Why is that so hard? Why are you always telling the Israelites not to forget the God? Of course they're not going to forget you to get out of Egypt. It is incredibly difficult to keep the beautiful from collapsing in the good. That's why there's this emphasis on remember, remember, and remember. Remember, the beautiful was not merely the lucky. Remember, the beautiful was not merely the good. It's this constant memory. And there's a way, too, in which if indeed all of reality is a halo, like the word is analogous and expanding, what is memory but relation and a kind of expanding? Hell, in a way, is moving toward a dot. Heaven or salvation is a moving toward a halo, in a sense. Halo, heaven, angel, but I'm using the Hofstadter term, right? Like a range, right? So that when you lose memory, what happens to someone who has Alzheimer's? They lose the path. They become like a dot. They become algebraic, right? They become less geometrical and become in a single point of time, right? And that's a kind of form of damnation, is losing memory. So you see this emphasis on memory, because memory keeps you as more geometrical and like a halo, a whole situation, of which then is precisely what you need in order to actually be a full human being. And these rituals of waiting is to help you remember the lack, to remember the beautiful, even if it doesn't show up, because you're constantly carving out a useless space as a reminder that you are then habituating yourself to that useless space that is possible because of the ethical life, so that you can actually remember the indefinite, which if you ever forget the indefinite, ergo the beautiful, then you are susceptible to capture of the system. You lose the capacity to create demand in the economy versus stimulate economy. And you become the kind of psyche that isn't flexible, but actually is more algebraic and steamrolled. So I think religiously, and then of course, this has a big impact on equality and all of the other stuff you were talking about. Because if we're all in this together, trying to be ethical for the sake of the ritual, oh, well, you're better at this part of the ritual than me, I can clean the stool, you can do the chant, then what you see is, since the ethical is all for the sake of the ritual, we can determine who is most fitting to do different things from our ethical positions, and we have an equality in that we are all equally committed to the quote-unquote useless project, and the ritual, and some things are better than other things, and we're all equal because we're all participating in the same indefinite. And because the thing is indefinite, nobody can capture the big other over everyone else that they are participating in. Because the big other, per se, that is the basis and commonality of all the ethical activities, is indefinite. It is beyond you, right? And so I think you have to have some sort of conception of the useless, the beautiful, the indefinite, if you're going to have equality, not fall into some sort of neurotic power structure of the big other. So again, I think what the problem is, in religions, they could more easily link the ethical to the ritual, to the waiting, to the remembering, of which then makes sense of why the ethical and the beauty are distinct and why ultimately it leads to the beautiful. Whereas today, the ethical is associated with the nation state that is tied to law, not ritual, not waiting. And thus it is more likely under that paradigm to collapse the beautiful and the good in problematic ways. So those are, but let me give it to Javier Thomas Wynn and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Rivera.
Yes. I think like maybe the name we can give for the fixing the good or collapsing the good from beauty is, I would call it the moral aesthetic as such, right? And I think actually Nietzsche's slave morality is just a really good example of, like, you're subjecting yourself to givens and it's sort of unquestionable for you. That's how I would interpret slave morality. But then also Luber's connection with identity, to say, like, I'm a big cat. Nietzsche talks about this too, that the slave morality is a man that tries to affirm he has subjected himself to the good opinions of others and the bad opinions. So he's fundamentally a man that doesn't create any values. He merely subjects himself to the values of what is given. So the moral aesthetic, this is a really dangerous one, because the moral aesthetic doesn't even understand that it's an aesthetic as such, right? Like if I were to have an argument about what's good and evil with someone, That's not an aesthetic for them. That's how it is. But to understand that it's an aesthetic is to fall into maybe the aesthetics of beauty, which is to understand that beauty is what reveals the aesthetic as always in flux. What I like about Nietzsche pointing out the Socratic, and I think there just needs to be a different term for it, so maybe I'll just call it intelligible or moral aesthetic, is that it wants to rid itself of any suspense. And I'll read this passage here because I think it's just brilliant. This is Nietzsche responding to the more rational method of the tragedy. He goes, everything laid the ground for pathos, not for action. And whatever was not directed toward pathos was considered objectionable. But what interferes most with the hearer's pleasurable absorption in such scenes is any missing link, any gap in the texture of the background story. So as long as the spectator has to figure out the meaning of this or that person, or the presuppositions of this or that conflict of inclinations and purposes, he cannot become completely absorbed in the activities and sufferings of the chief characters or feel breathless pity and fear. So the moral aesthetic is attentionalism to its highest degree. So how do we get ourselves, almost you could say, how do we remember that we can never be completely absorbed? How do we remember that there's a gap in the story? How do we remember that there's a suspense that is necessary? What I also like here is Nietzsche adds that the noble artistry, and this is what I was thinking about the noble common, is that it masks the necessary and makes it appear accidental, right? So I think it's just really brilliant the way Nietzsche is pointing this out between moral aesthetic and what we might call like noble artistry, which is remembering that we collapse the beauty into the good. And it's understanding that perhaps the beauty that beauty always collapses into the good, and that's part of the necessary and accidental element in which that happens. It's that awareness of that. But it's the moral aesthetic, I still say, is the really dangerous one, that fixes itself and subjects itself, and wants to not leave any gaps. Everything is intelligible. So that which is everything that is intelligible obviously is reducing beauty to the good, unquestionably. So, and I also like your point, Daniel, about this almost like natural arrangement of a hierarchy of values predicated around the indeterminate. This is very hard to do because hierarchy has already a bad connotation of something being evil and bad. Now, of course, Nietzsche always sort of undoes this because life is about subjection in some sense. The question is, I think what Nietzsche is questioning to us is, how do we think about subjection in a different relation? I think that's more difficult. How do we think subjection that is not, or does not feel, or does not appear as evil, per se? And I think beauty has to be the answer to this, because I feel like subjecting yourselves to beauty is a way to get around this, but for people, it's dangerous. And I think beauty is dangerous, and I think beauty is tragic, precisely because it leaves so much gaps and indeterminacies for a person to encounter. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Magnificent, and I'll pass it to Mr. Wynn. And I meant to say that on that idea that Mr. Luber was bringing up on identity and the kind of courage, the problem with that is that there is nothing outside of relation in a sense is inherently good. Like, yeah, you're courageous because what if you're rejected for being a cat? But you see, the issue is it's algebraic because you're removing shared intelligibility because you're going to an identity. And the problem is you're treating identity as a substance when identity is actually as a standalone point. Algebraic versus geometrical does not exist. So yeah, there's a kind of courage to throw yourself into the void. But this is what's hard. Basically, no single variable is good outside of a context relation that is in excess to that variable, ergo lacking. Therefore, we have to actively think all the freaking time. Because at one point, like, you can't just say courage is always good, because you could be courageous to do something stupid. In today's society, there's a really good bet that stressing courage and fearlessness is the right direction, but you can never say unconditionally. So, this is because everything is conditioned, but there are higher probabilities than Mr. Luber, please, because I saw you lift your finger.
Yes, I'm so sorry. So like, as like a joke with like my friends, I make a distinction between overthinking and then over not thinking.
Yeah.
And most people over not think, which just means they stranglehold like a certain notion and they never deconstruct it. In fact, they just dive deeper and deeper into that notion. So it's like, I am a cat, and I'm even more of a cat, even more of a cat, even more of a cat. And like, the more I think about the fact that I'm a cat, they assimilate that was like I'm just thinking about my identity and I'm just actualizing what I'm thinking about. But actually, in a certain sense, you're actualizing something that you're not thinking about because there's no deconstruction essentially going on.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, one's identity must always be linked to a situation that they're willing to submit themselves to. So if you are a cat, you should eat mice. Now, if you are willing to eat mice, well, then the identity is actually linking to a relation with the external world, of which would validate the identity. The problem is people have identity without submitting themselves to an encounter with a certain situation that could surprise them, that would show that it is not merely an expression of isolationism, but is actually based in some sort of essential formulation, right? So that the problem is a certain assertion of an identity outside of a situation that puts a demand on you. All identity is valid to the degree, or notions of identity are valid to the degree that it results in you putting yourself in a situation that can put a demand on you. That sucks. It usually almost has to suck, right? Like when you say I'm a cook, that means you've been in a kitchen when there's a million tables to serve and it's really hard and you're sweaty and you don't want to be there. Oh yeah, you're a cook because you've been there on the Friday night when it's really, really hard. And if you say, oh, I'm a florist. Well, you've been there when you had to weed the garden and do all of these different things. Yeah, that really sucks. So identity has to be tied, in my opinion. Again, people can express the identities. That's a different topic. But what's interesting now, that is what I'm analyzing, is the assertion of identity separate from a situation of which puts a demand on you, and that you have to rise to the occasion of. Because once you do that, you get the ever pluralization of atomic assertions, where everyone's kind of isolationist assertions of people that are seeking a recognition from a situation of which you must go into situations that you force to recognize you, dang it. Hey, flowers, you think you're going to get weeds and dyes? Nah, man, I'm a florist. I'm going to make you have these flowers grow. You force the situation to observe you, dang it, not assert yourself against the situation. No florist would look at weeds and say, I'm a florist, and wait for the weeds to go away, right? You wouldn't say, I'm a cook, and wait for the meat to cook itself, right? You would say, I'm a cook, so I'm going to frickin' figure out how to serve all these tables, right? The problem today is the assertion of identity separate from challenge. The problem is people are associating the challenge with the uncomfortableness of saying you're something to people that may not accept you, and that equals the challenge, right? The problem is that's a challenge based on subjective assessments, not the facticity of a world that makes weeds grow. So then it gets in this kind of fluffy realm that can't find a shared intelligibility for a social intelligibility, and it ends up splintering apart into Duginism and reactions and political consequences, because we have to instead create the encounterology for people's notions of identity to then be challenged as a demand, of which then that is the basis of what people are doing. Otherwise, you can't have a society. That's the great problem we've been talking about with belonging. What are the conditions necessary for a society, right? Well, it's going to have a lot more to do with situations that people throw themselves into. So I appreciate what you're going to say. As a note, I think the issue is with the relation between beauty and goody, and this is why memory is a big deal. If there is something about beauty that collapses into the good, the only way to know they're distinct is to remember they were different, to remember that you experienced the beautiful and then the theme came, right? And so you have to always remember that the beauty is kind of hidden. Like the beauty leads to the good and then it gets concealed behind it, which then is the very condition where you can think it's an equal sign relationship. Same world where the beauty and the good where the beauty and the good in a sense collapse to one another. You could say that if beauty leads to theme, theme hides beauty versus equals beauty, right? But that's the same world. It's a world where they seem to be the same. You know, in a world where beauty is hidden by goodness and a world where beauty equals goodness, it's both the same kind of world ontologically, a world where they seem the same. How would you be able to tell the difference? There's only one way: memory, remembering the difference. And what do you have to, like, so memory is a big deal in religions. And then you also have to participate in rituals and habits and practices to keep remembering. Because here's the problem. If you forget something, you also forget you forgot something. Oh, frick. The very nature of forgetting is the loss of origin. And so if one day you forgot that you weren't able to tell the difference, that there was a difference between beauty and goodness, and that means you lost the capacity to tell the difference, you would also lose the capacity to remember you lost it. So then the religions are like, you have to do these rituals even if you don't see the point. Why? Because if you lose the thing, you also lose the capacity that you lost the thing. So we have to kind of habituate you socially to keep doing it, because if you forget, you also forget that you forget, right? And so this is where you then have to, this is where the useless, the negative pragmatism makes sense. You have to keep being willing to do useless things just in case you forgot something, that you also forgot you forgot something, so that you could remember that thing and go, oh, this is what I forgot. Uselessness and negative pragmatism are tied to memory. Because if you forget something, you also forget you forgot it. And the only possibility you could recover something you forgot is in realms of uselessness. Because by definition, if you think it's useful, you somehow remember its pragmatism. That means you remember something the thing does if you do it, right? Pragmatism and remembering are tied together. So if you want to remember something you forgot, it will always be in the realm of uselessness. It will always be in a realm of a negative pragmatism. And so the religions are like, here, you have to do these negative pragmatist things. Why? Because you may have forgot you forgot. And if that occurred, you may have made the beauty equal the good, and now you're screwed. But Mr. Nguyen, Mr. Jockin, and Mr. Rivera. Mr. Nguyen, it is always good to see you today, sir.
A pleasure. I'm just kind of trying to thread something. I think the main thing for today is, like, after last week's conversation, which was really brilliant for me, it's like helped frame things in a nice way. I think what's coming out today is like, and so basically today I've been working on this guy called Luigi Parizon, who was like the maestro of one of the guys I'm writing about, Gianni Vattimo. And Luigi Parizon's ontology is basically saying that we can't escape history, we can't escape interpretations, we can't escape the particularity of each moment. Basically, in Luber's terms, we can't escape theme. Like, we can't escape thematizing beauty. We can't help but place onto beauty a kind of good. And I think this, again, is like the same topic that's coming up today. Like, how is it, what is it about our relation? What is it about belonging or not belonging to language, to thinking, which enables us to experience the event of beauty, or the ineffability of beauty, or however you want to approach this thing in a way, you know? Like, even what Javier's just said, like, beauty is necessary but must appear accidental. Like, if you approach it with a necessity, you're already like overly determining what beauty should be, or what I expect from beauty, what beauty ought to be for me. And again, this kind of goes back to the letting, but I don't really want to talk about that today. I want to try and approach this a bit differently. And I think it basically, I found some really interesting quotations from this Luigi Parizon, who talks about truth. His ontology is about inexhaustibility. Being is the inexhaustible, which lets interpretations be historical. And this kind of goes to what Luber's saying, like, it's knowing, it's like having a good, which is perhaps stays aware of it, of the gap, of the difference, of the spaces in between, which make it impossible to approach beauty as such. But I actually wanted to go into Heidegger, but not talking about letting be, but about the word Gestell, like in framing. So like the question concerning technology, this word Gestell is is introduced, what he does at the beginning of this text is he affirms this word gestel, because for him this has an origin in the Greek, which is basically the way it's. Let me find what he says. He basically says, in modern technology, it's about producing and presenting. For the Greeks, it was actually formed around the sense of poesis, like poetry, but like poetry is a way of being, as a way of experiencing objects or things around it, which for Heidegger, and this is the quotation, producing and presenting for the Greeks is, quote, it lets what presence is of itself by itself come forth into unconcealment. And then he says, this producing that brings forth, for example, the erecting of a statue in the temple precinct, and then the challenging ordering of technology now into consideration in this text, are indeed fundamentally different, and yet they remain related in their essence. Both are ways of revealing things, of aletheia, of like disclosure, but in framing, what comes to pass is things are revealed according to a standing reserve, meaning what's brought to presence is therefore neither only a human activity nor a mere means within such activity. The merely instrumental, merely anthropological definition of technology is therefore in principle untenable. Basically saying this is what happens in our relationship to things today, in our relationship to beauty. We introduce a kind of pragmatism in some sense, which is trying to achieve those goods, to achieve that thing that we think we can grasp and manipulate and create as an object, to the degree that beauty itself becomes objectless. Like, and this goes again to like culture, the way we approach things, the way we approach how to define beauty, how we can be beautiful ourselves. We think that we have to achieve it by passing through these systems of goods, like changing something about the body, changing society's ideas of what should be beautiful or not. And I think what this does is it brings up two ways, or not two ways, but it's just a question of like the quality of knowledge itself. Like, what is it that's being presented that we can let present itself? Like, can we let beauty present itself? What do we have to do? What do we have to achieve? And I think from what I've been hearing today, like a lot of people in this group are saying that it is kind of a challenge. It is kind of a difficulty. And I think this goes back to last week's conversation. What kind of stood out for me is like, it really does depend on what you think about beauty. And I know thinking about beauty itself is then starting to categorize it and quantify it. But I think that is a necessary question, is to speculate on. It's like the same way that Heidegger speculates on being. Like, what is the truth of being? What is the truth of beauty? Immediately today we can say, I have my meaning, you have your meaning in some sense. You've had your personal experience, I've had my personal experience, which brings in this question of interpretation. Like, is it the case that we are always bound to interpretations of what is beauty, or is beauty in its event, in its presencing, in its disclosure, is it something which moves beyond the historicity of language, beyond the particularity of my own experience? Luigi Parisson says, actually, and I'll find one quote because it's really beautiful. He calls it like revelatory thought. Actually, what I can do very quickly, he talks about truth. So his book is Truth and Interpretation. We can use the word beauty instead of truth, because that's what I was doing, I think, when Jockin was talking as well. So, for example, revelatory thought is always at one at the same time expressive, because beauty offers itself only within each individual perspective. Beauty, and again, he's actually saying truth, but we can say beauty. Beauty is accessible only by means of an irreplaceable personal relation and can be formulated or thematized only through the personal pathway to it. Thought that starts from this originary solidarity of person and beauty is at the same time ontological and personal, and therefore at the same time revelatory and expressive, like themable in some sense, Thought that starts, oh wait, okay, I'm reading that again. Such thought expresses the person in the act of revealing beauty and reveals beauty to the degree that it expresses the person, without one of the two aspects prevailing over the other. This goes back to Heidegger directly, and Luigi Parizon read Heidegger. He was actually a pupil of Heidegger. This talks about the belonging again of being or truth or beauty and being there and our own particular instance within history within which we experience that disclosure. And I think this is the problem. And I think it becomes a challenge. It seems difficult. It becomes demanding. I think if we do think we have to achieve memory, I think this is my point, and maybe this is my difference in a way. I think if we think we need to achieve memory or we have to achieve remembering the difference, I think at that point we kind of make a bridge between where we are and where we ought to be. And I think that, but then this, I agree with this point in the sense that I think there is kind of like an imperative to remember. There is an imperative to think of the difference between beauty and the good. But I think the only way to achieve that phenomenologically as an experience of disclosure is to say, well, if the beauty is a possible event for me, I, in my own particular instant, in this historical moment, am open to that in the sense that I know that I can't force that memory because it's not just a memory. But in knowing that it's not just a memory, I'm remembering that it's not just a memory. And in that instant, perhaps there's a moment of beauty. And I think this is the thing, like achieving nothingness, all the stuff that I was more interested in. It comes to this moment of grace. Like, what do you really think? And this again is ontology in some sense about beauty. When do you think beauty comes into the picture? How? And I think the grace of beauty or the grace of being that I really read through the later Heidegger, I'm not going to use the word letting, but it's about letting. Like it's being is really graceful, and this is why I'm really enjoying Parizon's work. It's like being is inexhaustible, like is beautiful. Like you have this disclosure to the particularity of your own interpretation, but even in that interpretation, okay, one more quote and I'm going to stop talking because I found it earlier. It's about the historicity of two types of, oh God, am I going to find that? No, that's such a shame. That was perfect. Wait, I'm going to look. I'm going to type in historicity. If it doesn't come up straight away, I'm going to stop talking. Okay, look, make a distinction, ready? So this is the quote. If one wants to make a distinction, one could distinguish between the historicity, meaning the fact that all knowledge is subject to its own historical enunciation or thematization, etc. One could distinguish between the historicity that exhausts itself in the expression of time and the historicity that carries an ontological import. That is, between that which is solely historical and thus expressive of its own time without revealing truth, and that which is historical and also revelatory, in the sense that the revelation of beauty, but he says truth, according to the personality and historicity of interpretations, can only assume a historical form and have an expressive aspect. And I really agree with this. I think like language is the house of beauty in that precise sense. Like it doesn't mean that we define it or represent it or quantify it, but I think it means we can find, and this goes to the identity and difference text from Heidegger, we find identity not in terms of equality, perhaps not even in terms of sameness, but in terms of belonging. So I find my identity as a being in the sense that I experience the beauty as that which I experience. And that says something to me about experience. And I think perhaps with technology, we quantify everything and we only find this kind of lack, like this response of like overstimulation from this sort of abstract algorithmic thinking. Whereas perhaps beauty shows you that you belong to this. Then, of course, we go to thematize it. And I think maybe this is my last point. To be ethical about beauty is to let that experience or let the belonging of beauty be, even if that means forgetting it and trusting that beauty can shine through for you in the sense that it presents itself to you as a surprise outside of your desire to re-quantify it or re-experience it. I think when you go to approach it as a new, like a repetition of experience, you're already drying it up. And this maybe goes back to like this idea. There's the historicity that exhausts itself in the expression of time. But then, so this is Parizon's point. if you have historicity with an ontological import, it is the remembrance of the inexhaustibility of interpretation. So interpretation is itself infinite, despite the finitude of the moment within which you speak it. And when you get with that experience, it's like, wow, like even if I have my finite themes, I can trust that being is inexhaustible enough to keep on giving me, es gibt in German, being is what gives beings. It lets beings be. And I can trust that. And that's perhaps then where beauty is. Like being becomes beautiful at that point where it it gives. And I know I can await that experience. And perhaps then like that's my maybe difference for tonight is like maybe that is the easiest thing in the world, but it seems like the hardest thing when we get to the gap, because they're like, oh, there's truth in this gap, there's truth in this difference, there's truth in this waiting. But how do I wait? What moment? When should I wait? Because society is telling me that I'm an object to be used on a daily basis for wage labor. I'm quantifying my time. I experience myself through social media as an objectless object because I'm an algorithm for some sort of end or good. And then this YouTube is telling me what is beautiful. And I kind of agree, but I don't because it's framed around this person's career, etc. Okay, that's my final point.
Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. And there is this weird blend of the easy and the difficult. You know, Jesus says, my burden is light and take up your cross. What? There's this weird thing where waiting and letting is really easy and it's really hard to do easy things. I'll pass to Mr. Jockin Bavera. I think being is graceful, for all you have to do is let be and wait, and you'll remember what you forgot. So like being has a grace because you'll remember what you forgot if you can learn to let be and wait. But then the question is, how do you do that? I think the creative act is quite wild. Because I think there is something about creativity or the creative act, because suddenly you'll be reading a book or writing something and you'll remember a book that you forgot about, an idea you forgot about. The creative act or the encounter with the other, the philosophical spirit, all these different things we're encountering has something to do with this weird way that you're able to suddenly remember something you forgot. And there's something about the creative act that's useless. It's not within pragmatism, and it is kind of waiting. When you sit down to write a paper, you don't know what's going to occur. It's kind of useless. No one's going to pay you for it, and you're waiting for something to occur. Oh, it's just like this book I was reading on. So I read this 8 years ago, kind of forgot about it, and yesterday remembered I forgot. That came out in the writing of The Belonging Again too. And so that happens all the time. Likewise, in the love relation, you'll find yourself remembering you forgot something about childhood that comes back. This is the funny thing. The subconscious then is precisely why being is graceful. Because there is this thing that is active and alive that contains all of this that you forgot, that if you can let be and find the right waiting, these things can come forth. And this is, I think, really important. So we're talking about memory. And you mentioned this point that you can't will memory. So this is how I put it. I think memories are encountered. Recall is willed. We've confused memory and recollection in a sense. You see, when you remember something, you encounter it. Memories are in the world more than within you. You encounter memories. And what memories are things you forgot. Where recollections are ideas you bring back. Mr. Wynn, please.
This is one point. This is literally Heidegger's idea of like, how do we think at the end of thinking, at the end of philosophy? Well, thinking comes forth as gathering. We, as shepherds of being, can gather to mind the waiting that expects being to shine itself, but being is that which gathers to us.
Yep.
So gathering is how we understand language and thinking. Like when you walk down the country path, the tree gathers to mind the history of its own world, the worlding. But then, of course, that's your interpretation. But it's fine. So you're fine with the fact that you don't remember or do remember, based upon this. But then, of course, the artist who's writing is recalling, but only then to present the world of that text, and opening it. And also then the world connects to the earth, and the earth is the mystery of that which is excessive to that specific particular stuff.
No, that's exactly. So for me, to use the language, technical knowledge is recalled, and you have to recall your technical logic to do your art, of which is the moving on the path so you can encounter the memory that then you remember, of which you need to keep beauty from collapsing into the good. And this is where the classical people seem obsessed with memory. Why? What's the big deal, guys? Because memory is precisely the encounter with the thing you forgot, of which then pulls apart the beauty and the good again before they collapse again, because they must if you're going to live. But if you can remember they're different, you'll be okay. You forgot. Dang it. And now you don't know you forgot. What are you going to do? By having habits and practices of which keep you moving into useless space to encounter the memory again that you forgot. And then Bergson's emphasis on memory, and this notion in Augustine that there's something about memory that contains God, all of this different stuff like memory. But the weird thing is memory does not seem to be inside of you. Recollections are inside of you in a weird way. Memory is in the world that emerges in your relation to the world in the encounter that must be a surprise, because memory is a forgotten thing you forgot. So by definition, the thing you forgot must be a surprise. And that encounter with is the only way to keep apart the beauty and the good. So then you have to have practices of such. And I think the creative act is a lot of that. And I think basically in the conflation of recalling and remembering, we are conflating technical knowledge with memories of the beautiful, ergo collapsing the beautiful and the good, and you get all of these different problems. So I think that was all very, very well put. So, and then of course, if being then, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, if being contains memory, and being is graceful in the sense that it will give us our memories if we just let it, ergo let it be, then what we have to do is figure out the practices of letting so that being will give us those memories. And that seems to have something to do with the creative act. And then also critically, we had the net 95 on freeing speech, and we talked about annihilation, presuppositions to keep going. Freeing speech is how you keep the encounters going so people can keep encountering memory so that they can keep beauty and good apart. So this is why freeing speech is big as keeping the path going, because it is only on the path that you can encounter the memory. Thank you. Good recall. That you can encounter the beautiful as opposed to recalling the technical. But that requires the annihilation of assumptions, meta questions, presuppositions to keep you going. Because if you ever stop and say, I have the truth, I don't need to go anywhere anymore, I know everything, ergo there's no excess, ergo there's no lack, then you stop moving. And the moment you stop moving, you can no longer encounter memory. And if you can't encounter memory, you can't keep the beautiful and good apart. So the freeing of speech then becomes the political economic situation that keeps people in the possibility of encountering memory, which then is encountering other liveness, encountering beautiful to keep it distinct from Aztec, encountering the other person to actually develop as a subject. So then freeing speech and then free speech, Jonathan Rauch, Dietrich McCloskey, are all practical horizons of this possibility. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Mr. Rivera, and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Jockin.
You know, I love that this discussion came on memory and recollection, because the biggest takeaway from Plato's dialogues about beauty is you realize he's reliant on that immensely, a lot. It's the mechanism of basically to explain, not basically knowledge and beauty, and access to the beautiful. Now he uses the word like that's a translation I hear a lot in English is recollection, so there's gonna be some language misinterpretation, but the basic idea of I think the recall versus memory, it's a very useful one there. Because it's totally true in the creative act, right? It's basically as an analogy is basically this kind of grasping at, actually rhymes with my conversation with Luber on hidden ethonyms. So the whole point is that, ethonyms, right, that are from Aristotle's rhetoric are unspoken major premises that are then presented. You don't present the major premise, you just operate from minor premises. You just roll with that. And the revelation of creativity sometimes happens when people add in their own major premise that completely transforms the end result of the structure of the rhetorical form. That's one angle of it. But just in general, the larger point is that, yeah, this idea that memory, as we're talking about, is like a recollection of the soul, using Phaedrus from Phaedrus, is the sight of the beautiful as a form, right? And actually, man, it's like calculated that logos is man's essence, because if man would not be man without this quality. So I find that immensely entertaining. that the logos, right, is man's power to speak and gather unity, the gathering, right, the Wynn's point. It's particularly because of their recollection of encounter with the beautiful. So for Plato, it all structures from this argument that if souls are not immortal, which did not have access to the beautiful, encountering of it before they became mortal, and our power of logos of gathering recollection or memory, recalling memory. I know this language is a little awkward. I know the distinctions are being made, but work with me. That is what gives man its essence to be man. You would not, one would think if reading Plato initially on a casual reading, you would not think beauty would have such a powerful implication in its entire project in so many ways. And by the way, another angle of it is from Aristotle, the mark of genius is the power of recollection. Right from poetry, poetics, and rhetoric, which brings before the eyes revelations of recognition of things that are in diversity are held together. Very powerful points. Oh, it's in the chat. I was wondering if there's some. Yeah, they would be clicking. Good times. Okay. So that's the whole thing too, is like that gathering of the unity, right? Is that kind of resemblance, right? It's in this creative act. That's exactly what creative acts are. I mean, Daniel, your exact point. You had a resemblance. There was something you were reading that had a resemblance to something else you read. I do that all the time. It's definitely the mark of a crude creative act. And it's interesting the interplay, right? Because also a lot of times the mark of true knowledge is that free recall power. It's totally true. Like the way, Daniel, we know that you have true command of the net was that you are able on the fly to call exactly what episode a point came up. So this is interesting. So obviously they have roles to play. So this is not an outright dismissal of recall. It's actually one of our markers of knowledge. And actually, I think that's true in education. One of our markers of actually so that we know a subject knows something is their rate of, it's very important, their rate of speed of recall. It's very fascinating. So actually there's a time element in dimension of that. When someone has knowledge, when they can have immediate recall of a point. That gets hit in kind of trivia mode where we say like the one raises their hand first to answer your question, right? That's the angle. That's a very flattening bad mode of it, or not as positive. But there's other sides too, as what Daniel just pointed out, that kind of immediate recall to a larger network of relationships. But then the most creative form is this unexpected, surprising revelation of association. So that's probably the major note. Oh, by the way, I think Luber's point about recognition of a story, right, is measured. That's a very interesting point. There's actually a lot of discussion in data science and data visualization about that point. Every piece of data and what you present is a story. They use that language, storytelling. So you don't just present the data as it is, like as if you can. It's every time you do that, there's a story being told, and you get to choose that story and how you present it. So I think it's a very fair point there. Actually, by this note, for forgetting remembrance, right? This kind of memory of recollection and recall is that kind of intermediate state, right? Because you cannot force a recollection, like, or a memory. Like, you know, that's happened to me where like I forgot someone's name and I know it, but I cannot say it. And then when I sit there for 3 minutes, kind of going, I'm trying to will the name, it ain't coming out. And it's either by me just giving up and moving on with the conversation, and like 5 minutes later, I'm like, Cassie, like it'll just come up flying out of nowhere, or it will be through like, actually a fun story. This happened with a friend where I couldn't remember the name, and I give a bunch of associations, like just like this person had. I actually knew quite. It was so amazing because I could give all these descriptions about the person. They're from Texas. They were involved with this, but I could not come up with the name. And then my colleague came up with the name. I knew it. I recollected it instantaneously. I just found that very fascinating. I really was in this amazing state of indefinite ambiguity of knowing and not knowing at the same time. It was fascinating. I just want to share those notes. One last thing about the religious ritual, like just this is now a little bit of a tangent point, but I think it's relevant, is it's a legalism. Isn't it interesting when basically when the good gets collapsed into a legalism, right? Where it's a demarcation. That's how things are going to be defined. It has that strangulation quality. So actually it's interesting, just like we said, the beautiful, right, has this kind of, when we can be captured and basically be aesthetic, and the good can be collapsed from bad and evil. We're showing that there's that same problem going on. One of the elements of that is this kind of legalism aspect, right? Just like that strangles the good in terms of law is supposed to enable justice, right? But just like that, just like propaganda strangles art, as an example. Those are my points. I yield.
Outstanding. No, I really appreciate what you were saying. And I think every single form of everything has a privational form of it as itself. So remembering can turn into mere recollection or recalling, precisely because the thing that makes possible recalling is the remembering of the beautiful, of which can be moved to the merely recalling of the technical. And so this is where they talk about the hierarchy of being and different things, love, because love exists, lust is possible. But lust is a kind of reduced form of love. Mr. Sweeney, good to see you, sir. So likewise, the beautiful is the aesthetic. The merely aesthetic is a reduced form of the beautiful that is necessarily possible within the conditions of the beautiful. And that's the problem. And then if you take that as the very structure of being, as having that sort of reducing, that lack of shine, that dimming, that privation as possible in all things that are, then to Mr. Luber's comment, and I'll pass it to Rivera, Mr. Luber, I think the reason why, like you said, there's like, why isn't this more prevalent? It's because we all tend toward irony, and being is unstable because analogy is all. Like we are all tend toward irony because the way thinking works is through analogy, through creating a halo where we gather everything under the category of, say, tree, because we spot a likeness in this phenomenon that goes under the category. But this is really weird. Where do you locate that likeness? Where do you see it? Is it in the definition of tree? You apprehend a likeness between that phenomenon. Therefore, it's fitting to go under the category of this tree, but likeness is fundamentally metaphysical. It is fundamentally metaphysical because you cannot find likeness in facts. So humans apprehend a likeness, which is analogy. Likeness is analogy, of which then you put in the category of tree, which exists because of analogy, because you're able to categorize those analogies in likeness. But here's the funny thing. All thinking requires category, ergo, category threatens thinking. If you create a category, then it does your thinking for you, but thinking creates category, right? So likewise, remembering needs recalling to have the technical know-how to encounter memories of the beautiful in the world, which is precisely why you have the capacity to confuse the remembering with the recalling and lose both. It is precisely because you have the beautiful that you can collapse it into the good. It is precisely because the mind uses analogy. So this is the point, and then I'll give it to Rivera. We require analogy to think. That makes us possibly ironic because we can confuse the thing we see there as the category of tree versus a unique particularity with a likeness that we are categorizing, okay? That's why we can be ironic. We tend to confuse the thing in front of us with being the identity, ergo, according to an algebraic definition, okay? We say the tree is the definition. No. The tree is the likeness with the analogy that you as a human being apprehend, right? But because you can make that mistake, that means you can achieve intelligibility through the means of which would keep you from knowing the thing, because you identify it with a definition as opposed to your relation to it, right? And because that seems correct, because the vividness of the facticity of the tree seems to say to you it is not metaphysical or analogous, but it is actual as a definition, it is easy to make that confusion. But if you did not have that possibility of that mistake, you could not have the analogous relationship of which would move you from the tree to the judgment of similarity. And then the key realization is that that similarity is with the beautiful, not with the thing. That's the key. That's following Plato, right? The analogy of the similarities of the tree is moving you by analogy back to the source or the origin of the beautiful, of which is only possible because you have the possibility of making the mistake of reducing the judgment of the tree as itself with a category that is separate from the beautiful, ergo the good. That risk is necessary for the possibility of a movement of being toward an excess of which is beyond the being that otherwise we would be stuck in a certain circular auto-cannibalism, self-effacement A is A. So this risk must be there. And this also means, though, that being must be unstable to us because it is a thing known analogously. And if it is known analogously, that means it is not stable. It is known by the active participation in a relation and a conditioning of a perception, which makes me think of Layman Pascal's book on Gurdjieff that I know Mr. Sweeney was just talking about. An active working of that conditioning of experience nutritiously to do this, which means you can make the mistake. And if you can make the mistake, and the brain likes to save energy, it is likely that the average person will make this mistake, ergo why, to your comment, Mr. Luber, I think this mistake is so prevalent. But it is all necessarily bound up in the very possibility of existence itself. But let me pass it to Mr. Rivera and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Rivera.
I'm still thinking about Luber's question of how do we make an ego more flexible? And I think, one, there's a lot of things, right? The notion of categories is very useful. This is something that Nietzsche even points out himself. Slave morality is essentially always predicated on utility and what is useful. So categories are very useful in this case. But there was one point where that which was useful was precisely the byproduct of the encounter. So now pragmatism is actually a sort of lie about the encounter because it chooses to recall instead of remember, as you pointed out, Daniel, because remembering is the actual encountering in the world. Pragmatism tends to fall back or recall about the categories of what is useful, and that is strictly contingent on the immediacy of the situation. But thinking about a noble common, as I've been like playing on sort of Nietzsche's words here, is the fostering of enemies to make an ego that is flexible. Now, what does it mean to foster enemies or cultivate relations with enemies? Is in some sense to not have a pathos of revenge and resentment, but in which we honor our enemies. Actually, I think this idea of honoring an enemy has been completely lost. Like the more that I read Nietzsche, I start to understand that we have no concept of an enemy that is deserving of honor. An enemy is always deserving of eradication and elimination. Therefore, revenge and resentment. So a noble common is playing on the ironic position of that we need enemies. But a relation to enemies in which we cultivate honor, because honoring an enemy is perhaps the only way to actually remember that you forgot about your forgetting, precisely because you're leaving yourself open to an encounter, because an encounter is an enemy that you honor. If you despise your enemy, you're just recalling what they have did historically. So I'm still really fascinated about this idea of honoring, because I would say today I have no concept of what that even means. What does it mean to honor your enemy? That's completely lost to me. I have no idea what that means. I have no idea. But I'll leave it there.
No, I think that's delightful. I'll give it to Mr. Luber. Well, there's a way in which, let's say, you are under the value form of capital. You know, Mr. Stein has been talking about opening the eye of value. Then what would be your enemy might be perhaps the useless, as you've been talking about with negative pragmatism. That's your enemy. That's going to take away your status. You're not going to make money, right? So there's a way in which to open the eye of value, which, following Mr. Stein and Mr. Gaffney's work, I think you could talk about with the ability to organize yourself in terms of a society according to different value forms. There will be a way in which you have to honor your enemy to do that. And everyone's also going to think you're hanging out with the enemy because now you're lazy, where actually what you're doing is, and then that very anxiety that results is the process of the eye of value opening, per se. The very process of doing the useless or the Sabbath so that you're able to see other value forms, which if you cannot see, here's the key to capital with Marx. Capital works. This is why I'm so interested in the connection between, as Hofstadter says, the analogous mind and the tyranny of aesthetics. Capital makes everything fungible. It adds an equal sign to everything, which makes possible human rights because all humans are equal, but it also makes them reducible to the logic of capital. This is the double-edged sword of equality, right? And this is why I think we have to talk about a new basis for human rights on the encounter based on the freeing of speech that is beauty-based as opposed to a moral-based, because then everyone is equal in so much as they're in capitalism and they close their eye of value, per se, right? That they have use, right? But here's the thing. So capital makes the bookshelf like $20. So that's an analogy. This is why capital is so effective. The brain is naturally analogous. Capital is an analogy, and so your brain just eats it up. And with time, that becomes the analogy that is quickest at hand. So you get in the habit of using that analogy quickly, forget about the possibility of other value forms, and then you forget, you forget. And once you forget, the only possibility of remembering the memory is to encounter it in the world, and that's almost by definition going to sociologically look like honoring your enemies. Honoring that of which is a waste of time or dumb or different things. And then, of course, there's also something to be said about your enemy making you a warrior, not letting you fall into comfort, so on and so forth. And then also, I think there's different things too, where very often in the Nietzschean context, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Sweeney, I think your enemy, you find out, oh, wait, they're only on the other, they're just like me, actually. They're just on the enemy army because their government forced them to. They fell under propaganda. And by honoring my enemies, I see them as a human being, even if I still fight them, of which then actually opens up, wow, wait a minute, maybe there's an entire like capture going on with the nation state, right? So I think the honoring of the enemy is a kind of practice that opens up the subject to different kinds of experiences that then I think also too, there's a way in which if beauty shows up and it commands you to change your life, it's kind of enemy, right? You know, kind of says you must change your life. There's a kind of like aggression in that, right? And so those are some thoughts that come to mind, but definitely one of the problems is because of the capital form in being analogous in its character, it thus aligns with the analogous nature of the brain itself, which then over time becomes the most at-hand way of valuation. Then we forget that there are other ways of value, say, according to beauty, as we've been talking about. And to get out of that would require, I think, something about honoring your enemy. But let me give it to Luber and Mr. Sweeney. Mr. Luber, please.
I like that notion of honoring the impedance. In a certain sense, the impedance is what makes you forget, but then your disposition of honoring is what allows you to remember insofar as how to make the impedance beautiful. So for me, it's like I'm sorry I keep bringing storytelling in or just like filmmaking. It's just too close to it, so it's hard not to. But basically, and this is applicable, I think, for being in any relation. When you're thinking so much about a story, or like in other words, what like the Heideggerian sense of care, when you care about a story so much, what happens is the story starts coming to life more. You write a script, and then you storyboard it, and then from storyboarding it, you actually do you take practice shots where you practice the blocking on your iPhone, let's say, and it keeps getting more and more and more real. And every time it gets more and more real, you keep rewriting the story because the theme becomes more transparent to you. But as it becomes more real, the impedances become more and more real. The finite limitations become more and more real. So the trick at this point is, how do I honor these impedances insofar as I can make the theme still be transparent and not stranglehold what my original notion is and shove it into the impedance. So like the classic problem is like, oh, we are almost over budget. We need to make a solution to this problem in a film. How do you approach that? You approach it, in my mind, if you're asking that question, you're already fucked. Like, you're already gonna have to go over budget. The point is that you care, going into that position, you care so much that the story, you've repeated envisioning the story so much that it doesn't really matter what impedance comes forth. That in a certain sense, honoring the impedance is really not seeing it as an impedance, but part of the tension that makes the unfolding possible. And that's very easy from like a filmmaking storytelling perspective, you know, you just have to really do your due diligence. And in that sense, impedances just help actualize the story. But in real life, it's not that easy. Like, I keep going back to Nazi shit because I'm Jewish. It's like, when that begins to occur, how do I get in the position where I say to myself, this is going to make beauty more likely to reveal itself, even though it's so horrific? How do you get there? How do you make the ego more flexible in that way? And that, to me, can only be done, at least how I'm thinking about it at this moment, can only be done. And I'm always hesitant when I say only, and I like make some type of limitation like that. So immediately I'm thinking I'm about to say something incorrect. But anyway, I'm going to say it anyway. It can only be done when your approach to the status of a situation is in question. Always. But the status isn't in question. So it's like, oh, I'm the father of my child. But like the approach to how I father my child is in constant question. The world is changing. My child gets older. I have to adjust accordingly. But my status is fixed. Like it's sort of like friendship too. You know, I am friends with you. You can be a shitty friend for, let's say, a period of time. I then have to adjust accordingly. I have to act appropriate to the situation. And like that is only indwelling in the relation, in the care, in the repetition of you caring. And in that sense, a friend being a bad friend isn't an impedance, but it's more of like, and I hate the word entertaining, but it's more part of the entertainment of the relationship. It's actually what makes the relationship the relationship. So like when there's an entire state like Germany that's just like, fuck you, Jewish people, then you have to see it as, in a certain sense, like a play, where this is going to make whatever journey I'm on more fun in a certain sense, even though that seem like my only problem is, how do you have like that? I feel like that is the correct disposition to have, but how to like have that disposition while at the same time appropriately addressing the that which is making it entertaining. So like, oh, like they're trying to rile us up and kill us all. Like, how do you make that in a certain sense entertaining? And I know that might sound weird. It might come off like I'm not respecting the problem. I'm not respecting the pedants. But there's a certain sense of internal work, such that there's a certain internal consistency that you don't see it as necessarily like a fixed impedance to be overcome, but it's something that you work with to discover something new with. Like that's how you. That's like Dasein with, like how you are with being is never by overcoming being. Because if your mentality is to overcome or destroy, you're not letting being be. You're not letting, like, to use Wynn's language, you're not letting being be. And typically what happens when there's an impedance, like something like Nazis, they aren't letting beings be. So if you respond in that type of disposition, in my mind, the other party, the other entity in the relation is more inclined to adjust and naturally become in a position of letting beings be. It's almost like acting, it's almost like mimicking. It's like if you're closer to beauty, that which is closer to beauty will allow everything else to mimic the entity that is closer to beauty in a certain sense. Like that's how powerful beauty is. It's something where it's like, oh, like the Nazis are forgetting beauty, but in them forgetting beauty helps me remember beauty. And then I can move, like with the dance, like Daniel talked about, I can move in a way where then I can be having the beatific vision, which then it makes the Nazis more likely to change and have their own beatific vision in terms of their theme remembers its relationship to beauty, and insofar as beauty is that it doesn't collapse into the good, essentially. So I think it really comes down to having this certain level of care, which brings forth a repetition, all for the sake of making the theme more transparent. And this repetition, for the sake of having a more transparent theme, allows your ego, your identity, to shift in a way that allows people to also see the beatific vision, which then, commands them as an individual, and could potentially allow that other to lead you. Even if you started the process, let's just say, if you actually have this open stance, someone else can, in a certain sense, finish the process. It doesn't all come down to you. It's not about you anymore. And there's something very cathartic about that. And I do think in our society, that type of catharsis is not common, because community and belonging isn't common, because there's a lot of pressure and anxiety when you don't have that. But that's a side note. Anyway, I just wanted to say one more question that I was just thinking. And I'm hung up on what Javier was telling me with Bard's comments, because he's a smart guy. So I'm confused. There's something I'm just not understanding with what he was saying. And I have to go back and listen to Javier, you reading his comments to you. But it's just how do you even talk? How do you just talk? If the concept of goodness and beauty, what is it? How do you even communicate if the true motivation of communication is by interest, by something as shallow as that? I don't understand why get rid of Platonic notions. I don't understand why that's an actuality. I understand what might colloquially be the case, but that doesn't mean that there's soundness to having these Platonic notions. And there's part of me where it's yeah, I'm down to not revert to past mentalities, and to kind of think about the world that we live in, which is a different world than back when Plato was around. But it's about sublating those past mentalities into the current appropriate mentality. It's not about forgetting and getting rid of or not acknowledging. It's about a level of sublation. There's something anti-artistic about that move, and and scientific, because the science has to account for the historicity. Otherwise, it's blind. It's if you don't know the studies that were done into your study, or the things that were involved in your study, there's a certain myopicness that you're going into with your study that doesn't seem very scientific. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. This is great so far.
Delightful. No, I agree. So a few things. Hannah More, which was one of the great abolitionists of the slave trade in Britain, she said, it is imagination that makes the world. And when you go through and look at the history and you say, so what moves people out of something like Nazism or apartheid or different immoralities, right? It's a lot to do with something like a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a philosophical change. It's communities. One of the great mistakes we've made is we think that the world morally advances or intellectually advances because of information, when it tends to be from different conditions of formulation. And that has a lot more to do with imagination and art and creativity and different things. Because what that does is imagination motivates you to entertain a different relation with the subject. And you see, once you relate differently and entertain it differently, you say, well, wait a minute, maybe Jews are human. Huh, yeah, maybe they are. What would that actually mean, right? And so there's an entertaining that can change things. But here's the issue. Why would you, if you don't have a society that believes in, say, beauty, or something where imagination is about memory and encounter with memory to get back to a lack or excess, then you would never think that imagination could have these radical formulative possibilities on the moral, spiritual or cultural impacts of society. You would move more so in the direction of information. So then we try to legislate morality or say that is bad to do, but then people don't care. Like they don't listen, right? Beauty gives authority. And what Hannah More understood in Fiery Convictions, you see this also, is that beauty confers authority. You're like, if you can work on people's imaginations, you open up to their capacity of seeing the other as a human being or as another, which then creates that shine, as Hegel talks about, which then you see them as inviting you into a capacity of story you otherwise could not curb, but you have to focus on the imagination. And you're not going to do that in a society that doesn't even see that as a valid category, right? Because right now, there's a weird way in which creativity in this sort of beatific sense has been replaced by a capital entrepreneurship where creativity is about making new products that you can sell on the market. Therefore, beauty gets captured by use and pragmatism and can't be in service of a uselessness to create a certain Heideggerian clearing to make possible the encounter of a new formulation. And then the question would be, what are the socioeconomic, technological, et cetera, conditions of which would increase the probability of the average person in the society being able to formulate according to such, so that they would be able to see the other as other, encounter the other, and not be overwhelmed by anxiety? And I think it has a lot to do with changing the classroom from a trivia information-based structure to a formulation-based structure, as someone like James K. A. Smith talks about with liturgies, and other people, the shamanic tradition will also talk about. So I think that all gets very, very important. And then that increases the probability. Here's the issue. Information will never help you remember what you forgot you forgot. You have to be formulated in order to increase the probability of you carrying yourself in the world of encountering that would make you realize you forget. And I think, again, there are like to your question on Plato, I think there are interpretations of Plato as eternalizing, as eternal forms, in the same way there are interpretations of Christianity that are getting out of the world and salvation from the world. But then on the other side, you have incarnation bodily, where it's about new creation. Likewise, Plato by form is talking about formulation according to beauty that is incredibly practical, and the gathering of particularity with different things. And what we're talking about with that Heideggerian gathering is to think of Plato at the end of book 7 when he talks about orbiting as a gathering, which is a formulation, not a stable eternal identity, right? Because if Plato is talking about a entertaining, and then I'll pass to Mr. Sweeney and Mr. Wynn, if he's talking about some sort of entertaining of the fact that thinking is always analogous, and therefore forms are a participation and mastering of the analogous nature of how thought is in of itself, as realized in the active memory, and the alignment with thinking as it is, the soul, is also alignment with the republic, the society, then if you can see that thought is analogous, and therefore the well-ordered society will also have an analogous relationship, a halo, as Hofstadter said, thinking halos. The tree category analogously gathers under an expanding halo of everything that has the likeness of that category. Likewise, the society is a halo that gathers everyone under the people that have the likeness of the human being or American or whatever together. Then thinking aligns with society, well-ordered soul with a well-ordered society. And then the form is not an unmoving state, but a moving and expanding or going back and forth halo relative to that formulation, all of which is beautiful, all of which is the dance. And so I think if we see Plato that way, then we can tie him into this encounterology that seems necessary for the formulation of the subject to see how beauty commands us to then so halo and to so formulate. But that's going to get into formulation versus information. So those are some thoughts that come to mind. But let me give it to Mr. Sweeney and Mr. Wynn. Mr. Sweeney, it is always good to see you. I hope you are doing well today, sir.
Hey, Daniel. Yeah, I'm doing well, and I apologize to jump in mid, not to miss the first aspect of what you were talking about. But Javier said something that made me want to jump in, and that was this question of honoring your enemy, which made me think. So, when I have a complex relationship with somebody, and I'm not quite sure if they're my friend or my enemy, what's going on there? And then I thought, how do you honor your enemy unless you know your own shadow? And it seems like you need to know your own shadow before you can honor your enemy. Because whenever I make an enemy, I feel like there's part of me in that person that I'm feeling animosity towards. And I was also thinking about Thomas. Andrew kind of changed the word enemy to obstacle, or what was the word you used? Impedance. Yeah, he said the word impedance. He changed the word enemy to impedance, which is an interesting move, and I think it's half true. And I wonder, I just like, it's more like a question. I wonder about the need for enemies. Do we need enemies, or are they impedance? And what is an impedance? Because sometimes an impedance on an enemy is really a friend, and sometimes a friend is bolstering your ego and propping you up and making you they're actually corrosive to your soul. So what we call friend and enemy is really, it's something really worth thinking about. And I know there's people, I have complex relationships with, and sometimes I feel like they're an enemy, and sometimes I feel like they're a friend. You mentioned Bard. I often get into really, vicious arguments with him, and then he's very friendly at the end of them, and I was like, how can you do those two things simultaneously? How can you attack me so viciously and still be my friend? And we end up being friends in the end. But I guess he's the kind of guy that really loves having enemies and enjoys that. And I don't know if I do. And I wonder if the reason for that is that I'm not in touch enough with my own, my own shadows, my own enemies, my own like I don't have them under control. Otherwise, I wouldn't get so emotionally upset by these kind of things. So anyway, that's what Javier made me think of. And in terms of having a noble enemy, I also made the connection between nobility and beauty. So often nobility means that we have to sacrifice the instance of our sense of wanting revenge for a particular thing and kind of give up the fight and stay within the nobility of, kind of Bruce Lee kind of thing where you have to lose, you have to learn how to lose. And that's the nobility, rather than there's not much nobility in just trampling over somebody, because you have some superior cognitive ability or there's no nobility in that. I feel like having a nobility towards your enemies is putting into question the notion of enemy in the first place. So anyway, that's what I got from. That's what I wanted to say. I believe.
No, I think that's magnificent. Thank you for being here and saying that. I think that what's interesting, I completely agree with what you're saying on the own your own shadow. One of the reasons why it seems to me the creative act is so huge here is because in writing or creating, you tend to encounter your own demons. You have to there's a kind of encountering your shadow in the creative act. And then the creative act also has this weird thing where you remember something you forgot. Oh, I read that book I haven't thought about forever. There's something about the act of creativity that is so strongly tied, and I don't think it's by chance. Like Heidegger gets into is interested in poetry at the end. People like Berdyaev, the meaning of the creative act. There is something about creativity that has this bringing forth of your shadows. And then we were also talking about the ethical being necessary in the religious to be able to go into the space of ritual, to then be able to wait. You're engaging in fighting your own shadows, not because you necessarily have a preset knowing why you're facing your own shadow, because then that might just be part of facing your shadows to be a better employee, following corporatism. But I'm going to face my own shadows, not even knowing why, but knowing I need to in the creative act to see what comes forth. And then that is also putting myself in the position of remembering what I forgot, which has the possibility of encountering this. We've been talking about the relation of beauty and goodness and theme and different things and memory and Augustine and Bergson, which then has the possibility of encountering this indefinite, according to which I can then know there's a distinction between the beautiful, the excess, and the good, of which in being naturally ironic and analogous, I am prone to naturally forget without regular ritual and regular sort of habituating myself to keeping that eye of value open, to use Mr. Stein's language. I'll give it to Mr. Wynn. I think also what's so interesting, the question of the enemy-friend stuff, and then there's also it's almost like the acid relationship, right? The relationship that's just acid and kind of destroying you. Is that good? Is that bad? It's almost to me that without a concept of working to encounter the beautiful, you can always see the good of everything and the bad of everything, and you just kind of ending up flop-siding, right? It's good to challenge yourself. Yeah, but I could challenge myself to say learn a random language from around the world, and that wouldn't inherently be good, right? You can say, well, it's good to befriend an enemy. Well, this guy wants to shoot me, isn't interested in philosophy, and all he does is mock my family. Well, that doesn't seem right. So there's this, here's the funny thing, that when Nietzsche, like this befriending of an enemy, it seems like the enemy is in this between space of challenging you, but challenging you for a way that makes you more toward the beautiful. Well, how do you tell what that is? Human discernment. The ability to judge when that is in role or not, a human activity, which then it's like you're a cook in the kitchen saying, when is this person being a complete a-hole for no reason and I really shouldn't talk with them, versus actually, no, they're unveiling to me that I need to be a little more comfortable with a-holeism. How do you tell that difference? You're in the kitchen. Should I add some salt? Should I add some sugar? But this is why, again, education is information versus perpetual formulation and active discernment in formulation, more of that meta shamanism or this kind of like thinking through or this working on your ability to have nutritious experience. This is everything, because otherwise, to use that Hegelian term, we're forever stuck in one-sidedness. Because you could always come up with a reason why you shouldn't have friends, because you need to learn to not be needy, why you should have friends because you need to have relationships, why you shouldn't have enemies because they're acid, why you should have enemies to challenge. You can always come up with that, and then you're just stuck kind of forever in different things. So Mr. Sweeney, please.
I just want to follow up. Like one thing I've meditated on constantly is a statement by Ivan Illich, and he said that the definition of a friendship is to be able to tolerate the intolerable in another person, because we all have an intolerable aspect to us. Like there's a way in which every single person is intolerable on some level, and we can decide to dismiss that person completely, which is very easy to do. And then just stick around with people who are like us. But then I guess the discernment comes in. Oh, okay, are we engaging in a codependent, abusive relationship, or is this a good MMA fight, which has certain rules, and we're in that arena because we've chosen to be, and we're fighting against people who are, we're playing. There's an aspect of play there, even if it gets kind of heavy. Then that's acceptable. But when it's and then but it is, the discernment is difficult in that sense. So yeah,
I think that's very well put. I mean, generally, it would have to be expanded on. There's a sense in which, is the person intolerable because in their presence you're forced to confront your own irony and your own inability to be good, because what they do is make you realize that you actually don't like the beautiful because it becomes a judgment on you, like in Camus' The Fall or different things? Or are they intolerable because they don't honor the beautiful and the good? There's someone who actually hates it, and that intolerable comes from a place of a kind of justice that is, the beautiful is in fact the beautiful and should be honored. And it's as if the ability to tell that difference between when is someone intolerable because they, in a sense, make you reflect on yourself to see your own, follies and incompletions and ironies, and that's why they're intolerable, because they're a mirror, versus they're intolerable because they're almost, not to say people are demons, but like demonically enjoying a mocking of the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? Like there seems to be a difference between those things. But then, of course, sometimes, well, very often when someone makes us reflect on our own fallacies, we accuse them of mocking the good, the beautiful, and the true, so that we can then pretend like the thing we don't dislike is them making us reflect on ourselves. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir. And I'll have to run myself in a little bit for obligations, et cetera, so forth. So, but those are the fine differences. Here's the key. The situation itself will not tell you that difference. You yourself have to be able to discern that difference, and that means discerning your own relation to that situation, of which generally we have not been taught to do in school. We have not been taught to think in terms of that formulation, how we formulate our understanding of the situation and then are formulated by that formulation, like the TV or technology, McLuhan, the medium is the message, the formulation is the form, per se. Like that is not what we're taught. And when we're not taught that, we have like no chance of keeping the beautiful from collapsing in the good, or confusing capital B being with lowercase being. So I think that's all very well put. Let me give it to Mr. Wynn and Mr. Luber, and then I will have to run here in a bit. But Mr. Wynn, please. Love you, Mr. Rivera. Thank you for that wonderful talk with Mr. Luber. Mr. Wynn.
Okay, let's try and thread this together for myself, because I did have dinner for 10 minutes. So I was a bit out the way, but it's nice how this has kind of come to honoring, and I really enjoyed what Sweeney said about nobility. because again, like I said last week, pressing Control F on my Word document and type in the word noble or nobility, because I realized that Heidegger speaks about nobility, and what basically it goes back to a note I started to make, which says like this idea of honoring the enemy. I think if we base it upon what the conversation was before, it was like forgetfulness of the difference between beauty and the good by which we try to get to beauty. Like that's the idea. It's like, or depending on what we then said, because everyone has their own certain idea of like, are we stuck within our own relative interpretations towards this event of what we're calling beauty? Like, is there really a beauty that breaks through their own particularity of language? And again, connecting this to being, like Heidegger's point is that in the history of Western metaphysics, we have forgotten being. And that is the problem of metaphysics, is it conceals being in some way. Towards the end of his life, he starts realizing that actually even the concealment of being is being's own self-concealment from us in some sense. Like the way in which we're thrown into technology, in the framing within which we are used for ends outside of our own control, because the general horizon of our shared existence is about being objectless objects for purposely doing something to accumulate more objectless objects, etc. The question is like, how do you honor this? How can you honor the enemy that conceals for Heidegger this event of being? Now, if we connect this to beauty, if, as Jockin says, the good in a way will always conceal beauty, if you try to achieve beauty through some good, some state, some fascist state, to go to Luber's example, you're going to conceal what you're trying to do because you'll end up in perversions and inconsistencies and antagonisms because you've tried to achieve something by totalizing it through the ideological good in some sense. I think what's interesting about this last period of Heidegger is he says, no, actually, because the root word of inframing in technology is Gestell, like we said before, and even poetical way of being is about inframing, it's about producing statues, we cannot escape production in some sense. We cannot escape thinking or interpretations or determinacies in any sense. Like we are thinking beings that think. So when it comes to this question of how do we approach something like beauty, which seems to be excessive or less than our ideas of it, how do we achieve this? And I think this goes back in a way to what Javier introduced with this honoring, because I made a note, honoring the enemy, because we made a distinction between memory and recalling. And recalling is like the technological thing that we do when we recall something for some technical end. Like recalling the knowledge I learned in that class concerning mathematics, for example. To say that what Heidegger says is recalling in itself is not a bad, it's an enemy because it can conceal, but it's also what lets us use logic to build bridges between two fields of either side of the river. And the only way to allow the enemy to be productive, or not productive, but allow the enemy to be, and this goes back to what we, the words that Sweeney used, like, it was on the list on the right. A good obstacle in some sense, you know, like someone who can provoke you and make you think. The only way to make that enemy valuable or noble is to let that enemy be in some sense, in the sense that it then doesn't dominate you. It then doesn't over affect you in the sense that your self-relation to yourself makes that enemy a problem because, you know, like this is what's interesting with the shadow idea, like confronting your own shadow prior to having this ability to honor the enemy. I think Zipancic has this reading of Nietzsche where she talks about the shortest shadow. So Nietzsche's whole work is to reflect upon yourself, because at noon point during the day, there is the shortest shadow, which means to reflect upon your own inconsistency in some sense. So for her, the good, the knowledge that we get to, is to allow ourselves to know that we will always be inconsistent in some sense, or non-all, or like the Lacanian non-all. And I think this is the point, like, you can only honor when you accept that there will be enemies, there will be the forgetfulness of being, and you allow that to be whatever it is, because actually what is noble is what is provoking you to think or to allow you to be in some sense. And then there's this quote from Heidegger, which came like when I typed, like the scholar in Country Path Conversations says, And again, it goes to releasement, by the way, which is my whole interest at the moment. So the scientist says, then please tell me also in your curious emptiness, in what respect releasement can be akin to what is noble. Scholar then says, noble is what has origins, and the teacher jumps in, not only that, but that it is that which abides in the origins of its nature. And then the scientist says, oh yeah, like now authentic releasement consists in this, that man in his very nature belongs to that which regions, which means that which whatever happens to be the case happens. Sorry, I lost it, is released to it. So for Heidegger's last period, it's like to be with what is noble is to be released to whatever comes to be, including an enemy, including forgetfulness, including recalling things for technical ends. And when you do this, you won't be dominated by technological thinking. Of course, you will in a social aspect, of course, but like in a self-relation, is you let that darker side of you come forth. You don't judge it, you wait on it, you know? And I think that in a sense, this goes to beauty. It's like you then have the space to let beauty shine forth. Because you're aware of the fact that things can happen of themselves in that sense. And I think that's how the enemy in that sense becomes noble or honorable. And I made a note to honor recalling. To honor recalling means to see that technology lets us build a statue, to write a poem, to build a bridge, to medicate. And this is what I want to say with Jockin, Plato's theory around the good of medicine, is in itself the enemy to be honored. The good in this sense is to be honored, for it is only in honoring the good that we can enjoy language and finitude and ideas that are temporal, knowing that the event we're looking for, in some sense, cannot be grasped or attained through those goods. Instead, it's about releasing over to what is noble. And in that sense, like Heidegger says, like technology is the saving power, because it brings you to that point where you can release things, because you say, look, I can no longer be an objectless subject, but now that I am objectless, I'm also free to move around a bit more. Anyway, yeah, that was a bit, it's hard to tie these together, but I can definitely see a connection with what was said in the first half and now with this idea that Javier is pushing for.
No, I think it's fantastic. Well, to me, the letting be, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber for closing out and running. Letting be is the possibility of the beautiful coming forth. And to me, letting be is the necessary posture so that you can respond with the good versus by the good. Because if I'm active, then it's going to be by the good. Therefore, the beautiful and the good collapse. But if I let be, then whatever comes forth, I can respond to with the good as a kind of tool that then I release again. This is why letting be and releasement, I think, are big. Letting be is the necessary waiting, the negative pragmatism, ritual, all of that, by which beauty can encounter, and you're ever waiting, no guarantees, because it's the inexhaustible. From that posture of letting be, that seems to be the only posture by which you could act with the good versus by the good, and that's the only way to keep beauty and the good from collapsing, right? And then letting be is then, in terms of the classroom or the society, the freeing of speech. We're not going to say what is good. We're going to free everyone to keep speech moving, let it be, let the movement occur, and then when an injustice arises or whatever, then we can act with the good against that thing we encounter in counterology versus by the good, which then risks, of course, oppression, all of the notions of justice and all of these different problems. I think also what's interesting with the enemy-friend distinction, an enemy is not a stranger. So what's the difference between friend, enemy, and stranger? A relation. Most of the time, you're not going to have an enemy with someone who doesn't care about something you also care about. There has to be enough similarity so that there's a relation, right? Every friend can also potentially be an enemy if you piss them off or start insulting the things they care about, which, by the way, your friends are the ones of whom you know what they care about most and probably best. So you are in the position to turn them into an enemy best because you know where to poke. A stranger would be very difficult to turn into an enemy unless they were told by their nation state, you're part of the easy, evil American empire, but then they have a similarity with you in terms of nation state, right? So even then, there's a kind of thing going on, right? And so the issue is that, like, I can think of enemies in wrestling. Oh, that's the enemy. That's Jefferson Force. We have to beat them. Well, that's because they wrestle too. And funny enough, wrestling as a common interest could be the basis of a friendship because we both wrestle, but it also can be the basis of the enemy, right? Because you're on the other team. And so there's something about the reason why enemy and friendship seems kind of all bound up versus from as distinct from stranger is because they share some sort of relation with your ultimate concerns, to use that Tillich thing, your values, your relations, your situations, right? And so then there's a way, and I definitely think this is true, one of the best ways you can avoid enemies is by not having any ultimate concerns, by having no passions, by having no investments, by not having anything that you care about. And that's actually what a lot of people do. And I think that's what, I honestly think that's the main thing that Nietzsche is going against. He's like, no, if you don't have enemies, that probably means you don't care about anything. You've never done anything for yourself and you've never invested in anything. You're just doing what the society has told you to do. It's a passive nihilism. Enemies can be a sign of actually investing in something, right? But then funny enough, an enemy, because I do think we almost have to make a distinction between enemy and this kind of acid relationship where they're just kind of acidly destroying you, right? And you need to get out of that. I think an enemy is someone of whom would potentially honor you if you did something magnificent. Like I can think in wrestling, like the enemies on the other side, when like the other team went out and beat up Christiansburg, then even the enemies went, that was great. Like the enemy is someone who is in the position to acknowledge even the nobility in you if you in fact do something noble. If the person is not, if there's no possibility of your enemy ever seeing something noble in you by you rising to the occasion of a challenge, they're probably more so acid in a sense than they are an enemy. Please.
I just made a comment in the chat, like acidity at that point is what you said about stranger. And it made me think then, like, what about those things that we are obviously related to, i.e. money, capital? But in a way, because capital is like a self-alienated subject, to use Zizek's idea, it's a stranger. It's
Yes,
always a
exactly.
other that has the otherness. Like it's something we cannot look at your being and have a relation to you concerning those interests that are concerning you. So capital in that sense becomes the passive nihilist, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the great problems is they talk about capitalism as a great, like, tyrannical, like, scheming enemy. It's really just kind of gray and mediocre. But that's why it's so devastating, is that it is, in fact, a passive nihilism. And that passivity is also what is so tempting, precisely because, as Nietzsche's telling, there's something about the human that is prone to passive nihilism, this kind of mediocrity, which capital feeds right into, and then you don't open the eye of value. But then the answer is not removing capital, but learning actually to use it in service of values, right? Because it's not even like to make your identity fighting capital is to treat it like an enemy. It's too mediocre for that. It doesn't have enough value in it. Like an enemy would require something beyond passive nihilism. And so that would require some valuation that's deeper. And that's why overly attacking capitalism is beside the point. Now, we also in Belonging again talk about pricing mechanisms, coordination, and different things. But I think that associates, because ultimately what we have to see is nobody has come up with a value form to deal with global pluralism other than capital that creates fungibility to make great diversity intelligible to one another, even if I cannot handle difference. Because you as a Muslim, you know what 20 bucks is. I know what 20 bucks is. I don't have to understand Islam to interact with you. Great. So we can get along. Now, we get along by never talking about values outside of the commodity form, so it's reductionist. But what else are we going to do in a world that hasn't trained people to handle the real of actual diversity? So I think that's a wonderful association. But again, I would say the only way, and then I'll give it to Luber here, the only way to act with the good versus by the good is from a letting be clearing, which then, funny enough, I think letting be and releasement are also seen in the creative act. Because everyone knows if you write a short story, if you are too bent on making sure people interpret it the way you think it should be interpreted or forcing people to get the ideas out of it versus let it be, it turns into propaganda and sucks. The great writer or the great artist lets the work be what it is to people. And then when people respond to you about it, you might, with the good, respond, but you're not putting the creative work in the world by the good, according to what you think is good. There's a letting be. So I think the creative act is also an example of that. Please, Mr. Wynn.
Then this goes back to what we said before, and I think it's come up a few times, like technical thinking allows you to formulate music, words in some sense. So there is kind of like the necessity of a type of logic which, if totalized, becomes objectless. Like we become subject to technology if we totalize technique. But this is the point: when you release, you realize that each way of revealing things, meditative, calculative, is in itself noble. And again, like rather in a way, perhaps you can say the enemy stops becoming an enemy when they become noble in that sense, you know. Like even the Joker in the King's Court is noble. Like he's the fool, but he's the one that in fulfilling his essence. This is the word that Heidegger would use, like the essence of language, the essence of truth. The essence of the Joker is the most noble figure in a way, if the Joker can be allowed to not just be the stupid clown who makes stupid jokes. I think this has come up before actually in conversations, you know.
Very well put. I completely agree. There is something about the jester, the enemy, etc., so forth, that is part of the same nobility. The problem is we tend to naturally prefer strangers to enemies, which then means we actually make ourselves toward the mediocrity, the grayness, the capital, and different things. I think also what I think about, you must have something in your life that's trying to overcome you. I tell myself that this paper is trying to kill me. And it feels that way when you have this giant paper show up with analogy, with aesthetics, comparing Hofstadter and Pierre and the guy who did the cherry blossoms with the cup. It feels like the work is trying to kill you. It's out to destroy your brain and to overwhelm you, right? That's what I think. Like there is something about needing those kind of challenges, or the conversation is overwhelming, or the ideas are like there's some sort of, there has to be a thing that's overcoming you that you rise to the occasions of. But that is also a condition where you're working with the good, not by the good. Because the reason you're working with the good against that thing to overcome you is because you have a notion of the beautiful that is possible if you overcome that thing. But no guarantees. All you can do is create the space of waiting where that is possible. There's no guarantee that if you write that story or finish that paper or finish that wedding venue or do those relationships and you overcome the challenge, that the beauty will necessarily break forth. But it certainly will not break forth if you give up. And so I think of it that way. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
This is really good. I guess I wrote in the chat what I mean by active. It's just actively being in position to let it be. It's not the active in the letting be, because then you're not actually letting it be. But there's a certain getting to the right position, getting to the place where it's possible for the threshold to be met to let the water just be hot. Like, to use that example from what I was saying in the beginning of the conversation. Another thing, so like the emphasis, I think Heidegger points out that in reality, for the human being, there's only a letting be at the end result. The end result is that. But what I think a storyteller paradigm does, it has the emphasis of the work that gets you in the position to just let it be, which is something that, at least in my readings of Heidegger, he doesn't go into great detail about. He's just pointing out like the consequence to the storyteller paradigm in my mind. Another thing with like the impedance and like what Sweeney was saying and like with Bard, the reason why I use the word impedance is because like in a story, in the unfolding of a story, there has to be impedance. Otherwise, there's no story. But the funny thing is, once you realize that you need an impedance for an unfolding, it's not actually an impedance. So I use the word impedance because you quickly realize that it's just necessary. And then in its necessity, you can then change your orientation to what's occurring. And in that sense, there are no real problems. But the problem with that is when the stakes are so high that your life is involved, you're in jeopardy, someone has a gun, you know, it's very hard to put yourself in that position. So I'm always thinking in that extreme sense, how do you, am I speaking too idealistically? Like, is it applicable to that extreme situation where the stakes are so high that it seems like you can't actually get there from an orientation standpoint? Another thing is, I don't know much about Bard. I've seen him talk on your channel a couple times, Sweeney, but I appreciate how he's at people's neck. Like when I'm in the writing room, I'm very much like that. And like I brought up on the net, like we got to be more argumentative, and I definitely think we are. I think the beauty of I think the difference is when I'm in the writing room and I'm at people's net, they know that we have a shared project, we have a shared vision. So I'm creating a tension in order for that vision to kind of reveal. And if that isn't really explicitly known, then it can feel really shitty. And I think that is a problem. So I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary to even see your own shadow, to have that type of tension where someone is at your neck, because in order for them to be like that, there's a certain vulnerability. They have to have such a strong position, but at the same time, they have to be aware that that position, the more strong they are, the more they have to realize how wrong they could be. And like what I was saying in the beginning of the conversation, if that is the case, the more wrong they can be and they get shown that they're wrong, then they're instantly really right. So that's the beauty of being in that shared project. So like I like being really strong, making strong claims. And part of me in the back of my mind is like, I'm hoping I'm wrong. I'm hoping I'm wrong because then I'll be right in like a very narcissistic way. I just always want to be right. You can't lose in that way. So I think it's about presentation and creating tension via vulnerability. But initially there's the presentation that it's all for the sake of revealing beauty, revealing being. And that can get lost in the weed if that initial presentation isn't known. So fuck, I forgot my other thing that I was gonna say. I should have written it down. I should have written notes. I was just listening too much. You're talking too well, Win. Like you're not letting me take notes. I'm listening too much. But I'll pass it off to Daniel. This was great. Thanks, Daniel, for this, as always.
Well, thank you, fine gentlemen. Well, one of the issues, Bard will emphasize in the Dark Renaissance in general, the kind of need for pathos, right? Like this emphasis that if you don't have pathos, if you deny pathos, if you just suppress it, then it's only a matter of time before it comes out and destroys the entire thing. But one of the issues that you just brought out is the difficulty of pathos if there's not the notion of a shared project. Under the loss of given, after the loss of givens, as Belonging again talks about, under global pluralism, it is difficult for people to know what the shared project is. That being the case, you have a problem. If pathos does not come out, I agree with Dark Renaissance, then you're in huge trouble. And if your project denies pathos, you're in huge trouble. But then if pathos comes out, you need to have a shared project or a shared basis so that that pathos can be interpreted in service of that project. But what do you do if there are no givens? This is a massive problem. And this is where the kind of infrastructure of beauty and all of these things really have to, yes, that's exactly right, Win. This is part of the issue, is how indeed do you do that? Mr. Luber, please.
This is where that meta aesthetic or theme really comes into play, because that shared project are our lives if you can't see the theme, because that is the dimension of belonging ultimately. So that's why, like Jockin saying we're missing a word, it's like if you just, it's really obvious in storytelling that it's theme. So it's just like that, it's just Yeah, we're just missing that dimension. We just need to clarify that dimension. And then people like Bard, it's very easy for, and I don't know well, but like for shifting that position where you're like, I'm going to be strong playing, I'm going to be a shared team. So therefore, it's, I hope I'm wrong. Like that's the mentality. But you think you're right initially, but in the back of your mind, what's being distanced is the fact that you actually want to be wrong. Like you're craving to be wrong is when you're making strong claims. And like if you don't realize that, that's just because you're not aware of your shit to the fullest extent. Like it's like you're fetishizing wanting to be wrong in a certain sense. I mean,
No, I mean, I would definitely say, Mr. Luber, that sometimes taking a strong position is in fact inspiring people to strongly respond to you. In fact, to kind of deconstruct your position or to really find out if that position is valid or not. No worries, Mr. Luber. And yeah, I think theme beauty, well, this is where if you're going to replace capital as the value form, which becomes the shared basis by which to understand pathos or not as either being for helping us create capital profit or not, then you have to create a new valid value form. And what is that going to be without pluralizing in a manner that nobody can identify as pathos is in service of the value form or not? Ergo, a source of theme of which can unify people together. And so this is where the problem of shared intelligibility and escaping the capture, leading to the Nickland, dark enlightenment, et cetera, so forth, are very strongly tied, which I think gets into the letting be. Yes, and the freeing of speech, and actually then making the shared practice precisely this freeing of speech, precisely this sort of cultivation of a relation to a lack of which then could be excessive as precisely a source of beauty. And really the value form is the capacity of people to condition themselves as subjects to perpetually experience the theme that says you must change your life. And then funny enough, the essence of all themes of beauty is that you must spread beauty. Your theme might be through storytelling. Yours might be through building a house. Yours might be through having a family. But the funny thing is that the command of beauty always in essence is a spreading of the possible encounter of beauty. But precisely because it is through a theme, it is possible to confuse the expression of the theme, say storytelling, with the beautiful meaning, I must make everyone a storyteller, or I must make everyone a screenplayer. Ergo, you are now working by the good versus with the good, and now you are under totalitarianism. But precisely because beauty must give you a theme, a command, in order for you to participate and be towarded in a manner via the command, via the shared standard to know your pathos, to then go spread the encounter of beauty, you are at risk of confusing the command with the thing, the good with the beautiful. And the brain, which in being analogous, is prone to confuse the thing with what is being pointed to by the thing, because that's what an analogy is, likeness. You are then prone to make that mistake by the very way of thinking that is analogous, that must be analogous to make the command intelligible. So the thing that makes the theme intelligible is also, which is thinking, which is analogous, is also structurally primed to make the mistake of confusing the command with the thing doing the commanding, the good with the beautiful, the thing pointing with what is pointed at. And the reason why everything must be analogous as such is because it is in time, therefore it is changing and becoming, and because also we have to immediately, we cannot have intelligibility if we have a new category to understand every phenomenon we ever encounter. If with every tree, we have to come up with a new category, we'd all go crazy. So you have to come up with a general category of tree to understand every particular tree so that you can function in the world without breaking down. But that is precisely the necessity of analogous that makes you prone to the mistake that we have been talking about. That if you weren't prone to that mistake would mean you had no chance of functioning in the world and you wouldn't be thinking, you'd be a rock, right? So this is an inescapable risk of being, of which here's the thing. If indeed there was to be, and then I'll give it to Mr. Wynn, if indeed there was to be a beauty or is a beauty, or God, or et cetera, so forth, that is in excess of the human being, And the human being was not to equal that God. Good to see you, Mr. Sweeney. I'll be running myself. And if human beings were not to equal that God, which then you wouldn't be talking about it, and there would be no difference between creation and creator, no difference between lack and being, lack and nothing, it would all blob away, conflate. If there is to be that distinction, then the only way we could relate to that beauty would have to be analogously, because it would have to be distinct, right? So analogy is the only possibility of the knowing of a capital B being or a capital B beauty or an excess of which we could know just enough to relate to, but not so much that it would overwhelm us or we would have to equal it. So analogy is the necessary epistemological structure for the possibility of intelligibly relating to a capital B being, of which also, though, must necessarily come with the risk of confusing the analogy with the tautology, the pointing with the equal, the thing with what is being pointed to by the thing, which is why we are prone to irony, and also why we naturally start in irony, because the brain naturally confuses the point of a thing is to be that thing versus to point to something beyond it. That's how we naturally experience. That's how we begin. And this is where religions say you're fallen. You start in being fallen. You start with a certain finitude. The condition of finitude is to start in an irony that must be possibly started in if you are to exist and possibly relate to that of which is in excess to you. Oh, and by the way, and then I'll give it to you, Mr. Wynn, if there was no possibility of this excess, well, then there would be no being. There would be no meaning, right? There would be no possibility of unfolding. So these are why it's all in this problem that you were describing in the chat, Mr. Luber, is in the sinews of the structure of being. But Mr. Wynn, please.
It was one little comment based upon what you said about time, like history and the fact that each interpretation, each analogy is caught up in time. It reminded me of what I read today, where Harrison talks about how the historical element of all historical interpretations and analogies and everything that we kind of seem to be caught in can, in a sense, be rescued from the flow of time. If I can read this quotation, I think it's a really nice way to finish because it goes back to when I talked about Parizon at the beginning. He says, the solely historical can do nothing more than express its own time. Thus, it is short-lived. So that basically says, like, the kind of passive nihilistic stance, which would say, yeah, but there is no being outside of my language, you know, like there is nothing outside of my interpretation in some sense, you know. So the wholly historical can do nothing more than express its own time. Thus, it is short-lived and fleeting, as it is gradually overwhelmed by time, of which it is nothing other than the mere product or image. In interpretation, however, the historical aspect and the revelatory aspect are so indissoluble, inseparably joined by the initiative of the person who makes itself and its own situation an organ of access to truth, which for Parizon is the inexhaustibility of being. The historical element, indispensable for the manifestation and formulation of truth, is in a sense rescued from the flow of time. It's interesting because history itself becomes rescued from time, but it doesn't mean that it's not analogous. It doesn't mean that it's not caught up in the fact that it can never reach being, but something changes about the quality of historical knowing, which then allows being to shine, to glimmer, to trace, to come forth in some sense. And I think in that sense, we can't escape contingency, particularity, and difference. Absolute knowing arises in that, you know, in that indifference. And there was actually one more thing, but I know you need to go. Well, actually, I can quote something again, the dash that came up last week in respect to Hegel, but it's the same point. Absolute knowing rather marks the point where experience turns into an experience of the impossibility of experience. The beyond of experience is strictly immanent to experience. And that's the place of truth. Within experience, within language, within what seems to fail, there shines something which can be called absolute. The absolute choice happens within that deadlock.
Absolutely. I think that's extremely well put. And I mean, there's definitely a way in which history, you know, as they talk about in Buddhism, the finger is not the moon. History is the ever orbiting of that finger that if we're not going to be on the moon or be the moon, the only possibility of having a relation to the moon is through an analogous relationship of a finger, and history is a clarification of various analogies by which to get at the finger. And so analogy, like you could say history is the development of analogy, of which analogy only works in the condition in which it can be confused with a tautology. Like you could not have a symbol if you didn't have the risk of confusing it as a point or a thing, right? All symbols work by pointing away from themselves, which means they entail the risk of you thinking they're not pointing away from themselves, because you can look at them and not think they point, right? That's Hegel's passing over into otherness, AB, right? Everything has a kind of Eucharist sacramental structure. It points away, it passes over, tree, branch, it moves. Everything has a kind of movement, right? The very movement of thought as analogous is a testament that time is more fundamental to space. And if there is a time, there has to be an excess to that time in which the time can unfold, that the only way we could relate to beyond the historic unveiling of the moment is analogously. And that's like the only way to get beyond the moment of history of which being is known through is pointing beyond, right? And there's always an exit. That's Heidegger, exactly, being in time. And so I think that's exactly right. But if then reality is temporal and excess, then really education should be about the formulation of analogous capacity, not the informing of technical knowledge to recall, which would only be fitting if the universe was primarily spatial and therefore point-based, and thinking was not analogously structured. So right now we have the entire socioeconomic order per se, based on, you could say, predominantly capital, which means it is against the very way that thinking is, that the world unfolds. So then, of course, you get this passive nihilism. Of course, you get this self-effacement because things are out of joint, per se. The falcon can't hear the falconer, etc., so forth. So I appreciated what you were saying there. And then, if you can learn to let that be, the whole reason that letting be can be graceful is because there's an unfolding beneath the letting be, per se. Like there's a being unfolding that then you're just letting it come forth, which things can come forth because temporality is central. And then please, Mr. Wynn. But so letting be is what is fitting for a reality of which is primarily temporal versus spatial and primarily known analogously, because letting to let is to point. Letting is always pointing as well. You can let be and it not be nothing because you're pointing to the excess. Please.
Yeah, and this is the point. So what is kind of excessive to letting your and this kind of goes to what Luber was saying about the problem of like actively letting. If being is letting, then to point at being letting is to point at you letting being be shown up as letting you let. And this is why I think this is what I know you need to shoot, so I don't want to just provoke me to say stop, Winston. Basically, like the beginning, the thinkers of my PhD is they always get to this self-relating moment where what they're talking about relates to itself, and so it ungrounds itself, and it catches some kind of a weird event where if I say this is an interpretation, but I say, but even me saying this is an interpretation is to it an interpretation, and I have to play this self-refuting game of this logical inconsistency. This moment appears within these three thinkers that I tackle. This moment appears within Parizon in some sense, and this moment appears within Heidegger, but he would say when you theorize that being is a letting, and you let being come forth as the letting, you're showing that being is letting you talk about it as being, because letting is this weird kind of concept that we don't always approach in our philosophical ideas, like we approach releasement as some kind of active comportment to things. But I think this is where things become easier when we recognize that actually, if things are being let be for me, if my forgetfulness is what is happening or taking place, then I accept that that's the way. Like if I forget something, I accept that I've forgotten that thing. I know that if being's good or graceful, it will allow that to be gathered to my mind, And if it's not graceful in that sense, because for example, if I have some sort of like dementia or something like this, then I am not being let be to remember. But then that's also noble in that sense, because that is how then that is, you know. And I think this is the point in some sense. And so what's excessive appears as that moment when you say, oh, that appears anyway, like that's appearing for me anyway, in whatever way. And I think that's why it's actually quite important to bring in that kind of ontology through history in some sense. So each interpretation has that ontological import, which allows us to belong to interpretations and to allegories about life, because that's what's being given in some sense, you know. And you accept that that's the way things are for now. Even for now is always a nice condition to add to that, because it's like, oh, that is how it is. But then letting shows you that, oh, for now, like there is an inexhaustibility to what can come forth, you know. But yeah, that's my.
No, beautifully put. I mean, often, like in logic, if you find a recursion problem or an eternal regression, you would say, oh, we must have done something wrong. We must have been using logic and thought incorrectly is what we should conclude. But actually we say, well, this means logically there's nothing, or that, you know, thought. But what if actually the recursion problem is a revelation that we've been using logic incorrectly or thinking incorrectly? It should be. The problem is we've been using thinking, seeking definition, when we should be using logic and thinking for the sake of letting. You don't get recursion problems in letting. You don't run into eternal regression in letting. The problem is we're using thinking to replace the encounter with definition. You can never replace the encounter. If you try, the reason we're interpreting these eternal recursion problems and regressions as evidence that there's no truth. Whoa, 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 whoa. What if we're using the logic wrong? Like, what if the method is being used wrong? We do that in every other field. Like in computer science, if your code gives you a bad result, you say, well, you must have screwed up the code, not that computers don't exist. We're getting exactly wrong, please.
The bad result is not finding beauty. Yes. Then you'll think there is no beauty.
Yes. It's and like
aim for beauty with that technological mindset, or the logic, not even technology, but logic. You'll realize that what was there to be cultivated and built was never meant to be found within that sort of logic, as if the description itself held beauty.
100%.
But then if you can build a bridge to the other side of the river, you might find what Javier said about the Dorito Mountain. Yes. It might be there for you.
Yes.
But then if you go into that with a logic that will, like equations, like it always comes back to what you said, like quantifying A equals A, then there's no room for surprise in that sense either.
Yes.
Whereas logic can build bridges. It can build this light, which enables me to sit here and talk to you on this laptop, which is being built through logic, through technique.
Oh, absolutely. But I would say, the thing is, like, we tend to build a bridge because we encounter a river that we need to cross. And then we use the logic to cross the river. When you get recursions when you try to replace encounter with logic, as opposed to have it be the handmaiden of encounter, per se. I hit a river, now I will use logic to build a bridge. Where do all the problems start? We say, let's build bridges. Do we need them? Nah. But let's build them because the GDP will go up. That's when you get all the crazy. That's when you get the self-referential GDP, self-referencing, and you get all these problems, right? When logic is the handmaiden or serves encounter, serves letting, then it's great. The recursion should be the revelation that logic should serve encounter, not that the thing doesn't exist where the recursion emerges. That would be like doing computer coding. And if the coding comes back right, you say, well, guess computers don't exist. That's what we're doing, creating all sorts of pathologies. Please.
This is an interesting point, which is, I think I've mentioned it a few times, like my future idea of how does letting apply to the social economic world? It's at that point where you can say, well, as a kind of ultimate good, or like even like categorical imperative, letting means to have systems of techniques and sciences and the transactions and interactions which enable you to then let that person be in some sense. Like food lets me be, consuming food lets me be, having shelter lets me be, like wearing shoes lets me go. And I think this idea of like, how is it that we build things and cultivate things is precisely at the point where the shoes let me walk on the road for a longer amount of time than I would if I was barefoot. Yes. We can apply this as the good.
Yes.
In that sense, like, and I think that is, and I've even I went back to the talk from last week, and I've got this paper idea called the ultimate good, like Plato, Hegel, Heidegger, because Heidegger's reading of Hegel talks about this beauty. And it's to say, well, letting becomes the ultimate good, even if it recognizes that it is allegorical, it is a theme, to use Luber's terms, but it's one which lets even the resentment towards the fact that it's just a theme be.
Yes.
And then the enemy of language, what Zizek would call the torture house of language, it no longer becomes a torture house, it becomes the house of being, or the house to dwell.
Yes.
Because you accept that technical thinking, logic will not achieve beauty, it will not achieve dwelling, but it can build you a house which gives you more time and heating to think your own being at that point. And I think this is why politics is like an inevitable result of why a lot of contemporary thinkers and yourself are interested in that socio-economic question. Like, how is it that we belong together? We have to talk about the interaction of human beings as well as our own self-relation at that point. And so that thing, I think, is kind of like free. For example, your idea of freeing speech. That's a way of formalizing this idea of releasing the space for the other to be able to encounter even their own wrong discourse in some sense. But without freeing speech, you're constraining that, you know. And I think this is why, and this is the interesting part, like how letting can actually be applied in such a weird way, you know. Because again,
well, not to interrupt, I'm so sorry. The key is encounter to logic is how you can then have a politics and economics that avoids recursions or self-references or eternal regressions or growth at the expense of the environment and all that. All you need to be able to do to have a society where right now it's logic, no encounter, who can actually, regardless of encounter, we're trying to systemize models so you don't need particularity. You can universalize over particularity. What we are saying is, no, you use logic in service of encounters in the particular. That is possible if people can survive the encounter. So this, or handle the encounter. If you can do that, this is what ends up happening. Right? We talk about the pricing mechanism as the coordination, it solves the coordination problem, right? If theoretically individual subjects were anti-fragile enough or had a training enough to handle encounters, then every individual could be a node, if you will, of coordination of where logic needs to be employed that may bring with it capital that you would have reason to think is efficient because it is based on the individual decentralized encounters of people with rivers. We need a bridge here. Oh, okay. Yeah, we do. But what that would require is anti-fragile subjects. If you have anti-fragile subjects, people that can handle the unknown and surprise and different things, they can then function as effective means of coordination of logic and then the political and economic means. Right now, where subjects are fragile or scared or avoiding encounter, you cannot have logic follow encounter. You have to have logic replace encounter, but that leads to inefficiencies of the coordination, recursion problems, growth at the expense of the environment, global warming, all these other problems. There's no way to avoid that, though, other than by removing the market, which causes mass poverty and all sorts of craziness, or having the coordination be based on a decentralized encounterology of individual subjects who can have that function because they have the anti-fragility to handle it, and then access to the liquidity to employ capital to build that bridge that they encountered at that river, right? So you get into liquidity markets, but it's based then on coordination on individual subjects. But to do that, you have to have people able to handle the encounter. And really, to me, that is where you let people encounter. Right now, we're not letting people encounter, right? We're replacing letting an encounter with logic, which then leads to all sorts of these recursion problems, self-reference, and then everything dies, which then we say, well, just logic harder then. Have better models, have bigger models, have more computer science, have big data. We'll freaking figure out how to logic without encounter. See where that gets you. That's what we're doing, as opposed to going, wait, guys, what if we're just using logic wrong? if it's supposed to be in service of something, not everything? No, that can't be the case. So this is the craziness, please.
A quick point as well. Like, I think that's the anarchist motive against like communism in that sense. Is communism is a logic which imposes 5 or 10-year plans
Yes.
at the service of the universal good for history, and it forgets the particularity of each individual, because that's the point. Like, I think Catherine Malabou is doing a lot of writing now on anarchism and saying, why are all of our philosophers of the 21st century so focused on communism? Like Alain Badiou, who would even criticize socialism to say that's not logical enough in some sense, you know? And it's true, like where like, and I think if you look at the people who are anarchists, and I've met some over the years, for example, in Barcelona, like a lot of those people, I would say, are human beings that are well adjusted to the difference of life itself. And that's why the figure of the anarchist is like, you know, the mohawk,
Sure.
like the person who doesn't really integrate themselves with the other of society and expectations, because perhaps they are more open to difference. They are more open to particularity. They maybe are more open to encounters, perhaps. Whereas someone who has rationalized Marx's ideas would say, no, communism, because the logic of communism is fitting. But then is it really then fitting at the particular point of human existence, you know, when those 5 or 10-year plans are imposed upon you,
Yep.
with the ideal of having a totalized social system that functions like a machine, you know? And that was Heidegger's critique against the eastern side of what was happening in Germany at the time, which was communism. Like, he didn't dislike the Marx in that sense, but he disliked the mechanization of human life for some end. Because again, that's like technological thinking. That's a logic which forgets that you can't find beauty with that sort of good, you know.
No, I think, and I think Marx is at his best when he's talking about the value form of commodity that makes everyone follow a certain form of social intelligibility out of which they cannot think. And anarchism is at its best when it's trying to free oneself from those social horizons. But you see, there's a difference between escaping the commodity value form for the sake of encounterology versus creating an alternative universal logic which will systemize everything into a determinism. Marx falls into trouble with his determinism, with the determinism and the systemization. Whereas the challenge now is to somehow be anarchistic in the sense of letting people encounter, but then having enough of a social infrastructure that you can then be socially intelligible with people and have technological advancement. That's really the great challenge, please.
Even then, seeing the nobility of having a sort of, and it came back to before what we said, like capital as the stranger, you know, as the acidity, that which is acidic in that sense. Like, perhaps if we have a different relationship to capital, and I've only, this is the first time I'm thinking about this really, then actually capital can be made noble in some sense, you know?
Absolutely.
Or maybe not, or maybe to a certain degree, but then in 10 years' time, that wouldn't be adequate enough for the next shape of our social relations, you know? Like, and I think this is the point of letting, is like, even what you let be or make noble by allowing it to come forth in technological thinking, etc. Perhaps for now, sure, but like maybe in 50 years' time, that won't be the case, because if you're open to the surprise of beauty, you'll recognize the inexhaustibility of the fact that your framework can change as well. Even the framing of letting perhaps and probably will be in 20 years' time a kind of void discourse.
Yes.
Maybe there'll be a more absolute discourse in some sense. And this is my thing. Like, and this is why I kind of like what Luber introduced with thematization, is like, it goes back to what Heidegger said, like manifold meanings given to being within the history. But then if we think about what Parizon said, history then can be, I want to get the words right because it was very nice the way he said it. Oh God. In a sense, rescued from the flow of time. Like, you know, how we relate to things. Even capital can be rescued from the flow of time in some sense, maybe, as like as a tool to be used for the interaction of people. Meaning using like the allegory of capital to facilitate ends that maximize someone's ability to find beauty. You're not finding beauty with capital, of course you can't, it's a dead thing. But as Zizek would say, it has an effect. And if you can utilize that effect as a good to allow more space for the encounter with beauty, then good, you know? And I would say I'm anti-capitalist at the moment because, of course, it's the opposite, because it's totalized its logic. It's a dead machine that's the most powerful non-thing in the world, you know? Yeah, interesting.
No, the key is the capital version of letting is creative destruction, of which capital is when you let the creative destruction occur, which is eventology. It's based on the encounterology. It's based on the encounter with the creativity that destroys the whole, and you let that be versus stop it with law and government to preserve corporatism. Then capital actually becomes an engine of the beautiful because it's facilitating the creative destruction of which is encountering with the beautiful. But and capital was always at its best when it did that, but it tends toward monopoly power once it becomes a mixed market through the state. And currently it is, so it must be opposed because it is now just in service of AI as a systemization. But the key is to change the conditions of capital back to the creative destruction, which gets into various laws in the school system and different things, which would then be a socioeconomic form of letting and the annihilation of the path to have the moving go forth. And then encounter would lead to logic versus replace it. But with that, my dear friend, I must run. I've enjoyed it immensely, Thomas Wynn. Always a treat. Always a treat to speak with you, my friend.
For sure. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Thomas Wynn. Always a pleasure.